Hey friends, I'm here to help you relax tonight. Get comfortable, let go of your worries, and let this story guide you to a peaceful, restful sleep. You deserve to feel at ease and leave all the stress behind. Be sure to subscribe and where are you listening from and what time is it there? I'd love to know. Don't look back. Whatever you hear, whatever you feel, don't turn around. That was the rule her grandmother had whispered to her when she was just 6 years old, trembling under the quilt during a stormy night. At the time, it had felt like just another one of those eerie old sayings meant to scare kids into behaving. But standing here now, alone in the dead of night, with the woods pressing in on all sides, those words rang in her ears like a warning meant for this very moment. The air was heavy, damp, with the kind of stillness that made every tiny noise sound magnified. A crunch of leaves here, the snap of a twig there. Something was moving out there, keeping its distance but making its presence known. Emily tightened her grip on the flashlight, the faint beam barely piercing the thick fog that hung between the trees. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She knew she shouldn't have come here, not after everything that happened to Michael. Michael had been the first. 3 weeks ago, he'd wandered into these woods on a dare, grinning and laughing with a bravado that had faded the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. They'd found his phone the next morning lying face down in the mud, the screen cracked and splattered with what looked like blood. But Michael? He was gone. No body, no trace, just gone. Emily swallowed hard, forcing the memory away. She wasn't here to think about Michael. She was here to find answers. She'd seen the stories, heard the whispers at school. They all talked about the same thing, the thing that lived in these woods. They said it didn't like to be seen. They said it had no face, just empty, black hollows where its eyes should be. And they said that if you ever heard it call your name, you had already gone too far. Her name. A shiver ran down her spine. Was it her imagination, or had she just heard it? No, that was impossible. She'd only been walking for 10 minutes, sticking to the trail like her dad always said she should. There was no way anything, or anyone, could have gotten close enough to whisper her name. Emily? She froze. This time it was unmistakable. A low, guttural voice, almost familiar but distorted, as if someone were speaking underwater. It came from somewhere behind her, but she didn't dare turn around. Don't look back. Her grandmother's voice was louder in her head now, drowning out her panicked thoughts. The urge to turn, to see who or what had called her, was almost unbearable. But she knew. Deep down, she knew that whatever was behind her, it wasn't something she wanted to see. Her breathing quickened, and her legs felt like they might give out beneath her, but she forced herself to move. One step, another. The voice came again, louder this time. Emily? It was closer now. Too close. She broke into a run, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she tore through the trees. She didn't care about the branches scratching her face or the roots threatening to trip her. She just needed to get out, to get away from whatever was. The voice came again, this time from in front of her. Emily? She skidded to a stop, her heart hammering in her chest. The beam of her flashlight swept across the trail ahead, but there was nothing there. Nothing she could see, at least. And then it happened. The flashlight flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging her into complete darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. She slapped the flashlight, shook it, anything to get it working again, but it was no use. The only light now was the faint silver glow of the moon filtering through the treetops. Emily? This time the voice wasn't just close. It was right behind her. Emily's knees buckled, and she staggered forward, her hands scrambling against the rough bark of a tree to steady herself. Her heart raced so loudly it felt like it was vibrating in her ears. The voice behind her was unmistakable now, not just a sound but a presence. The air was colder than before, biting into her skin and stealing her breath. She couldn't stay here. She knew that much. Fumbling blindly in the dark, she reached into her pocket for her phone, praying it still had battery life left. She managed to pull it out, but before she could unlock the screen, the voice came again. This time it wasn't her name. Don't run. It was a command, sharp and cutting. And for a moment, she almost obeyed. Her body froze in place, like a puppet with its strings suddenly pulled taut. She couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. Then, as suddenly as it came, the paralysis broke. She gasped, sucking in air as she forced her legs to move again. She stumbled forward, her phone slipping from her trembling hands and hitting the ground with a dull thud. She didn't stop to pick it up. The trail was disappearing under her feet, the familiar markers of trees and rocks fading into an endless wall of black. Her flashlight was useless, but she didn't dare stop running. The voice was chasing her now, louder and angrier. "Don't run." Her lungs burned and her legs screamed for her to stop, but she didn't dare. She thought of Michael, of the phone they'd found, cracked and covered in blood. She thought of her grandmother. Don't look back. But she was losing her way. The trail was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and the trees seemed to press closer with every step. She could hear them now, branches creaking, leaves whispering in a voice that wasn't entirely her own. And then the ground disappeared beneath her feet. She fell, tumbling down a steep incline, her body twisting and scraping against rocks and roots. When she finally hit the bottom, she lay there for a moment, gasping for air and blinking up at the sliver of moonlight above. The silence was deafening. For a brief, fleeting second, she thought it was over. Whatever had been chasing her was gone. And then she heard it. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. Something was moving toward her. Emily forced herself to sit up, biting back a cry as pain shot through her arm. She twisted it in the fall, but she couldn't think about that now. She had to move. She scrambled to her feet, her head spinning as she tried to get her bearings. The incline she'd fallen down was too steep to climb back up, and the trees here were thicker, their branches clawing at the sky like gnarled fingers. The sound came again, closer this time. Crunch. It wasn't trying to hide. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps as she stumbled forward, her feet sinking into the soft earth with every step. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. And then she saw it. At first, she thought it was just another shadow, a trick of the moonlight filtering through the trees. But as her eyes adjusted, the shape became clearer. It was tall. Taller than any human should be, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it were trying to decide whether she was worth the effort. And it had no face. Her scream caught in her throat as the thing took a step toward her, its movements slow and deliberate. She backed away, her legs trembling so badly she thought they might give out beneath her. "Emily?" The voice didn't come from the thing. It came from inside her head. She clamped her hands over her ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voice was everywhere, echoing through her skull like a cruel, mocking laugh. She turned and ran, the pain in her arm forgotten as adrenaline surged through her veins. She didn't know how long she ran or where she was going, but she didn't stop until her legs gave out beneath her and she collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The silence returned, and then she heard something that made her blood run cold. It wasn't the voice this time. It was a sound she hadn't heard in years, but one she would never forget. Her grandmother's lullaby. It was soft, almost soothing, but there was something wrong about it, something off-key and distorted. Emily's hands shook as she pushed herself up, her eyes darting around the clearing she'd stumbled into. There was no sign of the thing that had been chasing her, but the lullaby was still playing, growing louder with every passing second. And then she saw it. A house. It stood in the middle of the clearing, its windows dark and its roof sagging with age. The front door was slightly ajar, and the light from inside spilled out onto the overgrown grass like a beckoning hand. She didn't want to go inside. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to run in the opposite direction. But the lullaby was coming from inside the house, and she couldn't ignore it. Emily stood frozen, her eyes locked on the house. It wasn't supposed to be here. There were no houses in these woods. She was sure of it. And yet, there it was, standing like a relic from another time, its warped wooden boards groaning under the weight of some unseen burden. The lullaby drifted out from the open door, haunting and hypnotic. It was her grandmother's voice. She knew it as surely as she knew the scars on her knees from falling off her bike as a child. But Grandma had been gone for years. She wanted to turn back, to run into the safety of the darkness. But her legs moved on their own, carrying her closer to the house, her feet crunching over the brittle, overgrown grass. The closer she got, the more wrong the house seemed. Its windows weren't just dark. They were empty, yawning holes that seemed to watch her approach. The door swung wider, as if inviting her in. And the lullaby, it grew clearer with every step. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached the porch. The boards beneath her feet creaked loudly, their sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the woods. She hesitated at the threshold, staring into the inky darkness beyond the door. For a moment, she thought she saw something move inside. A shadow, fleeting but unmistakable. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice trembling. The lullaby stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed down on her like a weight, suffocating and absolute. And then a whisper. "Come in, Emily." Her breath hitched. The voice wasn't her grandmother's, but it was close. So close that it made her stomach twist with unease. She wanted to run, but something held her in place. She stepped inside. The air in the house was different. Heavy like the atmosphere before a storm. It smelled of mildew and something metallic, something that made her nose sting and her stomach churn. The door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, her flashlight clattering to the floor. Her hands fumbled against the door frame, searching for the handle, but it was gone. The wood beneath her fingers was smooth and solid, as if the door had never been there at all. Her chest tightened. The only light came from a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, shifting shadows across the room. It was empty, or at least that's what she thought at first. But then she saw them. Marks on the walls. Scratches, deep and jagged, as if made by something with claws. They covered every surface, crisscrossing over each other in a chaotic, desperate pattern. Her breath quickened as her eyes followed the marks. They led to the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to thicken and pulse like a living thing. Something was there. A figure. Hunched and motionless. "Grandma?" The figure twitched, its head jerking upward. Emily took a step back, her foot hitting the flashlight on the floor. The figure moved again, this time rising slowly to its full height. It wasn't her grandmother. It was tall, its limbs thin and angular, like branches stripped of bark. Its face, or what should have been its face, was featureless save for a single slit where its mouth should be. And it was smiling. Emily stumbled backward, her hands fumbling for anything she could use to defend herself. "Why did you come here?" the figure asked. Its voice was her grandmother's, but distorted and wrong, like a record playing at the wrong speed. "I heard you," she stammered. "I heard your voice." The figure tilted its head, the smile widening. "That wasn't me." Her blood turned to ice. The shadows around the figure began to move, stretching and writhing like smoke. They slithered across the floor, reaching for her with inky tendrils. She turned and ran, her feet slipping on the slick wooden floor as she bolted for the next room. The house was a maze. Every door she opened led to another room, identical to the last, empty, scratched walls and a single flickering bulb. The shadows followed her, growing thicker and more aggressive with every passing second. Her mind raced. She didn't understand what was happening. The house shouldn't have been here. The figure shouldn't exist. And yet it did. And it wanted her. She burst through another door and found herself in a narrow hallway. At the end of it was a staircase, spiraling upward into the darkness. "Emily?" The voice came again, closer this time. She didn't think. She just ran. The stairs groaned under her weight, the sound echoing through the house like a warning. She climbed faster, her hands gripping the splintered railing as she ascended into the unknown. When she reached the top, she found herself in a small room, bare except for a single chair in the center. On the chair sat something she recognized immediately. Her grandmother's quilt. The same one she'd hidden under as a child, listening to stories about the thing that lived in the woods. Her hands trembled as she approached the chair. The quilt looked exactly as she remembered it, down to the frayed edges and faded floral pattern. But as she reached out to touch it, she noticed something else. There was something under the quilt. A lump, small and motionless. Her heart pounded as she lifted the edge of the fabric, her mind screaming at her to stop, to run. But she didn't. She pulled the quilt back and her scream echoed through the house. Emily's scream died in her throat as her body froze. Beneath the quilt lay a doll, its glassy eyes staring straight into hers. It wasn't just any doll, though. It was her doll. The one her grandmother had given her when she was 7, the one she'd lost years ago. The doll's porcelain face was cracked, with jagged lines splitting its once perfect features. Its mouth, painted in a faint smile, seemed to twist as Emily stared at it. And then it blinked. She stumbled back, knocking over the chair. The doll toppled to the floor with a dull thud, but its lifeless stare followed her as it lay on the ground. "Why did you leave me, Emily?" The voice was soft, almost childlike, but it wasn't coming from the doll. It was coming from everywhere at once, echoing through the walls and vibrating in her skull. I didn't," she stammered, her voice shaking. "You left me in the dark," the voice whispered. "And now you're back." Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as the air around her seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on her chest. She glanced at the door, ready to bolt, but the hallway she'd come through was gone. In its place was another wall, covered in scratches that seemed to shimmer and writhe as she watched. The house wasn't letting her go. The doll's head tilted slightly, its glass eyes unblinking. "You forgot me," it said. "But I didn't forget you." Emily's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of nightmare, a cruel trick her mind was playing on her. But the pain in her arm, the chill in the air, the voice that seemed to crawl under her skin, it all felt too real. The doll twitched, its cracked arms jerking as if it were trying to move. Emily backed away, her foot catching on the fallen chair. And then the lullaby started again. It was faint at first, almost a hum, but it grew louder with each passing second. The same haunting tune her grandmother used to sing, but now it was warped, distorted, like it was being played backward. The walls began to close in, the scratches on their surface glowing faintly in the dim light. The doll's head snapped toward her, its mouth opening wider than should have been possible. "Stay," it hissed. Emily bolted. She didn't know where she was running. The room had no doors, no windows, no escape. But her legs moved anyway, carrying her toward the far wall. As she approached, the glowing scratches seemed to shift, forming a shape, a doorway. Without thinking, she threw herself through it. She landed hard on the other side, the air knocked from her lungs. For a moment, she lay there, gasping and disoriented. The ground beneath her was cold and damp, and the smell of earth filled her nose. When she opened her eyes, she realized she wasn't in the house anymore. She was in the woods. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together to block out the sky. The fog was thicker here, clinging to her skin like a second layer. But something was wrong. The woods were silent. Not just quiet, silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, no distant hum of life. Just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. And then she heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush in a way that made her stomach twist. She turned her head, scanning the fog for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. "Emily?" The voice was back, closer than ever. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, and she started running. The fog seemed to cling to her, pulling at her arms and legs like invisible hands. She pushed forward, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The footsteps followed. No matter how fast she ran, they were always there, keeping pace with her. And then, up ahead, she saw it, a figure standing in the fog. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long and its head tilted at an odd angle. But this time it wasn't alone. There were more of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, their silhouettes barely visible through the mist. They stood perfectly still, their featureless faces all turned toward her. "Emily?" The voice came from all around her now, overlapping and echoing until it became a deafening roar. She fell to her knees, her hands clutching at her ears as she screamed. The ground beneath her trembled, and the fog seemed to close in, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. And then everything stopped. The silence returned, and when Emily opened her eyes, she was alone again. The woods were still, the figures gone as if they had never been there. But something was different. The fog had lifted, revealing a clearing ahead. In the center of the clearing was a tree, gnarled and ancient, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. And at the base of the tree, half buried in the dirt, was a familiar object. Her grandmother's quilt. Emily's hands trembled as she approached it, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out, hesitating for just a moment before pulling the quilt free. Underneath it was something she hadn't expected. A photograph. It was old and faded, the edges curled with age. But the faces in it were unmistakable. Her grandmother. And standing next to her was Emily. But it wasn't the Emily she knew. The girl in the photo was younger, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. And standing behind them, just barely visible in the shadows, was the figure from the house. Its smile was the only thing in the picture that wasn't faded. Emily's pulse hammered in her throat as she stared at the photograph, her fingers trembling on the edges of the faded paper. The image was too clear, too real, and yet it made no sense. The photograph was old, as though it had been taken years before she was even born, yet there she was, standing beside her grandmother. The figure in the background, the one with the featureless face and that smile, was unmistakable. Emily's breath caught in her chest as she realized the truth. This thing, this, whatever it was, had been with her family for generations, and now it was after her. She could feel it, like a weight pressing on her chest, suffocating her. It wasn't just a memory or a nightmare. It was real. And it had been following her, watching her, long before she even understood what it was. She reached for the quilt, feeling the coarse fabric between her fingers. Something was buried beneath it, something that had been hidden away for far too long. Slowly, she pulled the quilt off entirely, revealing the dark earth beneath it. At first, she saw nothing, just dirt and roots tangled together in a thick mess. But then she noticed the glimmer of something metal. Emily's breath hitched. She hesitated for only a moment before she reached down, her fingers brushing against the cold, hard surface. She dug with her hands, pulling at the earth, until she finally unearthed the object. It was a box. A small, rusted metal box, sealed tightly. Her heart pounded in her chest as she ran her hands over the surface. There was no latch, no way to open it, but the words on the front of the box were unmistakable. For Emily, her name. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she stared at the box, its cold surface making her skin crawl. She wanted to leave it, to run, but something inside her, the same pull that had brought her here in the first place, drove her to open it. With trembling hands, she pried at the edges, pulling until the lid gave way with a screech of rusted metal. Inside the box was a single object, a small, delicate key. It was made of iron, shaped in an intricate design, and it gleamed with an unnatural shine, despite its apparent age. Emily turned it over in her hand, the cool metal sending a shiver down her spine. What did it unlock? A sudden noise behind her made her whip around. The woods were silent again, unnaturally so. But something wasn't right. The ground beneath her feet had started to shift. The tree in the center of the clearing seemed to tremble, its gnarled branches swaying in the windless air. And then the shadows, the ones that had been creeping along the edges of the forest, began to move again. But this time they weren't shadows. They were figures, dozens of them walking slowly toward her, their long, twisted limbs bending in unnatural ways. Their faces were still featureless, but their eyes were filled with hunger. Emily backed away, clutching the key tightly in her hand. There was nowhere to go, no escape. She had to do something. She had to. The ground trembled again, this time more violently, throwing her off balance. She stumbled but caught herself just in time. The shadows were closing in, their movements jerky and unsettling. And then she saw it. A door. It appeared out of nowhere, rising from the ground like it had always been there. It was a wooden door, weathered and old, with a handle shaped like the same key she held in her hand. Without thinking, she ran toward it, her feet barely touching the ground. The figures were right behind her now, their footsteps almost deafening as they came closer. The door was the only thing that could save her. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she inserted the key into the lock. It clicked with an eerie finality, and the door creaked open. Before she could step through, a hand grabbed her wrist. She whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat. The figure from the house was standing right behind her, its faceless grin stretching wider than ever. It wasn't smiling anymore, it was laughing. The sound was guttural, a deep, otherworldly noise that rattled her bones. "Do you really think you can escape, Emily?" it hissed, its voice like ice scraping against stone. She tried to pull away, but the grip on her wrist tightened, its fingers cold as death. The door behind her seemed to shimmer, as if it were fading in and out of existence. She had one chance. With a surge of strength she didn't know she had, Emily twisted free from the thing's grasp and threw herself through the door. The world spun as she fell, tumbling through an endless void. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then everything stopped. She was lying on the cold, damp ground again, gasping for air. Her body felt heavy, like it had been weighted down by the force of the fall. She pushed herself up, blinking against the darkness. The air smelled familiar. The trees, the dirt, the silence. But something was wrong. This place, it wasn't the woods. It was her house. The one she had grown up in. The one that had been abandoned for years. The one where she had last seen her grandmother before she disappeared. And standing in the doorway, bathed in the dim light of the hallway, was her grandmother. She smiled. "Welcome home, Emily." Emily stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. Her grandmother, alive, standing right in front of her, smiled with that familiar warmth that had always made her feel safe. But now it felt wrong. So wrong. Her grandmother hadn't smiled at her like this for years. Not since the day she had disappeared. "Grandma?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with disbelief. She couldn't understand what was happening. The house, her grandmother. This couldn't be real. It was impossible. Her grandmother stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under her weight. "It's been so long, Emily. I've missed you." The words felt heavy, as if they were coated in something dark. Her grandmother's voice, once a comfort, now sent an icy shiver through Emily's spine. I thought you were gone. I thought you disappeared." Emily took a hesitant step back, unsure of whether she should run or stay. The house, the walls, everything seemed to close in on her. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched toward her, like they were hungry for something. "Oh, Emily," her grandmother whispered, her voice soft and gentle. "I've never left. I've been waiting for you." Emily's stomach twisted in knots. The room around her seemed to grow colder with every word, the air thickening like she was drowning in it. Something was wrong? No, everything was wrong. The air didn't smell like home. It smelled like dust, rot, and something older, more ancient. This wasn't her house. Why do you look at me like that?" Emily's grandmother took another step forward. Her once kind eyes had turned glassy, distant, and there was a strange shimmer to them. Something dark, something that didn't belong. "I don't know what's happening," Emily said, her voice growing panicked. "This isn't real, it can't be." Her grandmother's smile widened, but it wasn't a smile of warmth anymore. It was something sinister, something that made Emily's breath catch in her throat. "You always were so quick to doubt," her grandmother said, a low chuckle escaping her lips. "Always running, always afraid. That's why it took so long to bring you back." Emily's mind raced. "Bring me back? What do you mean? What is this place?" The room seemed to warp around her, the walls bending in ways that defied logic. The door she had entered through was no longer there. There was nothing but the dark, endless hallway that stretched out behind her, too long to see the end. The house was alive, its pulse vibrating through the walls, through her skin. "Don't you see, Emily?" Her grandmother's voice had shifted, becoming deeper, darker, colder. "You've always belonged here. You always will." The words sent a jolt through her, and Emily backed away, her mind struggling to piece together the fragments of reality that were slipping through her fingers. The house wasn't just a house. It wasn't just her grandmother's house. It was something older, something that had been waiting, watching. The door to the room slammed shut behind her, and Emily spun around, her heart racing as she searched for an escape. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, they all seemed to close in on her. There was no way out. Her grandmother took another step forward, and the air grew heavier with every move she made. "It's time to come home, Emily. Time to stay with me forever." No, the word escaped Emily's lips before she could stop it. "I don't belong here. I don't belong with you." The room around her began to change, the darkness growing, suffocating her, filling every corner of the space. The faces of the figures she had seen in the woods, the ones that had followed her, appeared in the shadows, their empty eyes staring at her with hunger. Her grandmother's laughter echoed through the room, a sound that twisted in Emily's ears, pulling her deeper into the madness. "You've always belonged here, child. All you had to do was accept it." "Accept me?" Emily's mind screamed for a way out. She reached for the door, her hand grasping at the air where it should have been, but it was gone. She was trapped. And then something caught her eye. The key. The key she had found in the woods, the one that had seemed so important. She pulled it from her pocket, her hand shaking. She didn't know why, but something inside her told her it was the only thing that could save her. With desperate hands, she inserted the key into the nearest lock, the lock on the wall. There was no door there, no visible entrance. But she felt the pressure, like the house itself was holding its breath. The key clicked in the lock, and the wall in front of her trembled. A door. The door appeared out of nowhere. With no time to think, Emily yanked the door open and rushed through it. She didn't care where it led, she just had to escape. The hallway behind her stretched infinitely, but when she stepped through the door, the world shifted again. She was outside. The air was cold, but it was real. There was the woods, the same woods she had been in before, but now everything felt different. The fog still clung to the trees, but it didn't feel suffocating. The figures weren't there. The house was gone. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She was free. But the voice of her grandmother, the words that had followed her, still echoed in her mind. "You can never leave, Emily." She whipped around, her eyes scanning the woods. But no one was there. The forest was empty. "You can never leave." It was as if the words had imprinted themselves into the very air, into her soul. And as she stood there, trying to shake the feeling of being hunted, she knew, deep down, that her escape was only temporary. The house would always call her back. And the thing that wore her grandmother's face was waiting for her to return. Emily stood in the clearing, her body trembling from both the cold and the adrenaline. The fog that had once consumed the woods was now just a thin mist clinging to the ground, swirling around her feet like ghostly fingers reaching for her. She could feel the pulse of the forest beneath her skin, like it was alive, watching her every move. Her heart pounded in her chest as the truth settled in. She wasn't free. The escape through the door had been a fleeting illusion, a brief respite from the darkness that had been following her. The feeling of being watched, hunted, never truly left her. It was always there, lurking just beyond the edges of her consciousness. She turned in circles, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but the woods seemed deceptively calm. The weight of the silence pressed down on her, heavier than it had ever been. It was unnatural, suffocating, and it made her feel like she was standing in the eye of a storm, waiting for the next wave to hit. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind again, cold and sharp, as though it was being whispered directly into her ear. "You can never leave, Emily." It was a chilling truth. The house, the figures, the thing that had worn her grandmother's face, it was all part of something far older, far more malevolent than she had ever understood. And the worst part was the house wasn't just a house. It wasn't even just a place. It was a prison, and she was its prisoner. Emily stumbled backward, the weight of the revelation crashing into her. She hadn't just been running from something. She had been running from herself, from a fate that had already been decided for her. She had always been a part of this story, a part of the house's dark history. She had been marked long before she even realized it. A rustling sound from the trees snapped her out of her thoughts. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as she stared into the dense fog, her pulse quickening. She wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the mist, walking slowly toward her. It was tall, its limbs too long, too twisted. The same figure she had seen in the house, in the photograph. Its smile stretched wide across its featureless face, and Emily felt a cold chill race down her spine as it approached. "No," she whispered, stepping back. "No, please. Not again." But it didn't stop. The figure moved closer, its long, jagged fingers reaching out toward her. Emily stumbled backward, her mind racing. She needed to move. She needed to get away before it reached her, but her legs felt like they were glued to the ground. Fear had rooted her to the spot. "Emily," the voice came from behind her, distant and echoing. "You cannot escape." The voice was her grandmother's, but it was warped, twisted, like it had been drenched in malice. Emily spun around, her eyes wide in terror. The woods had changed. What was once familiar now felt alien, suffocating. The trees leaned in toward her, their branches like claws, and the air was thick with the weight of something ancient and hungry. The figure in front of her stepped forward, its smile widening even further as it closed the gap. Emily's chest tightened as she fought to breathe, her body shaking uncontrollably. It was here. It had found her. She had to make a choice. With every ounce of strength she had left, Emily turned on her heel and ran. The cold air bit at her skin, but she didn't care. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. The sound of her footsteps pounding on the earth was drowned out by the low, guttural growl of the thing behind her. The trees stretched endlessly, their trunks twisting and warping like they were trying to trap her in their grasp. The path she had taken was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of branches and fog. Emily's breath came in short, frantic bursts as she pushed herself faster, farther, trying to outrun the thing that was chasing her. But no matter how fast she ran, it was always there, just behind her, its presence suffocating, its laughter echoing in the distance. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet gave way. She tumbled forward, her body slamming into the earth with a sickening crack. She gasped in pain, but there was no time to stop. The thing was almost on her, its footsteps echoing in the distance, getting closer with every second. Emily pushed herself up, her legs trembling beneath her as she tried to regain her footing. She looked around, but everything was a blur. The fog, the trees, the ground, all of it was shifting, warping like the world itself was alive and it was playing a cruel game with her. In a panic, she sprinted toward the only thing that seemed real, the clearing ahead, the one with the old tree in the center. She had to reach it. There had to be something there that could stop this, something she had missed before. As she neared the tree, she noticed something, a shape just beneath the gnarled roots. The same metal box, the one she had found earlier. But this time, something was different. The key. It wasn't just a key anymore. It was glowing, its iron surface shimmering with an eerie light. And the box. The box was open, revealing a small, glowing object inside. It pulsed with a strange energy calling to her. Without thinking, Emily reached out and grabbed the object. It was smooth and warm in her hand, its light brightening as she held it. The moment she touched it, the world around her seemed to stop. The trees stopped moving. The fog stopped swirling. Even the thing that had been chasing her froze in its tracks. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Emily felt in control. The object in her hand, the source of the power, was her only chance. But even as she stood there, holding the object, she knew the truth. The house, the figure, the forest, it wasn't over. This was just another part of the trap. And the worst part? It was waiting for her to return. The door would always be there, and it would call her back. Forever. Story 2. It starts with a voice, trembling but steady, as if someone is speaking to themselves. Have you ever felt it? That sinking feeling when something doesn't feel quite right? Like the world around you isn't what it seems? There's silence for a beat, and then a cold whisper of wind brushes past, unsettling. This isn't the kind of story where people wake up safe in their beds. No. This is about the kind of fear that follows you, clings to you, and waits for you in the places you least expect. Our protagonist, Ethan, wasn't a believer in such things. To him, the world was predictable, logical. But what happened that night, the night he took the wrong road home, would change everything. It was late past midnight. The sky was heavy, clouds covering the moon like an omen. Ethan had been driving back from a client meeting, tired but determined to get home. His GPS glitched, the screen freezing before the route disappeared entirely. He cursed under his breath. The road ahead was unfamiliar, lined with trees so dense they seemed to close in with every passing mile. The asphalt was cracked, barely visible under the dim headlights. There were no signs, no markers, nothing but an empty road that seemed to stretch endlessly. And then he saw it. A woman standing on the roadside. Her back was turned, and she was dressed in something strange, almost like old-fashioned clothing. She didn't move, didn't wave for help. She just stood there, completely still. Ethan slowed down instinctively, his fingers tightening on the wheel. His heart thudded in his chest. "Do you need help?" he called out, rolling down the window slightly. No response. The woman's head tilted, just slightly, as if she'd heard him. And then, so quickly it almost didn't seem real, she disappeared into the woods. Ethan blinked, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? He wasn't sure, but something told him he shouldn't stop. He pressed the gas pedal and continued down the road, trying to shake the unease crawling up his spine. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It grew heavier, like a weight pressing on his chest. The radio crackled suddenly, the static loud and jarring. Ethan jumped, glancing at the screen. And that's when he noticed it, the time on the dashboard. 3:33 a.m. He was sure it hadn't been that late just moments ago. He shook his head, convincing himself he was just tired. But the road, it didn't end. No matter how far he drove, no matter how fast, the trees never thinned, the scenery never changed. And then, without warning, his headlights caught something on the road ahead. It was her. The same woman standing in the middle of the road this time, facing him. Ethan slammed the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. His car stopped just inches away from her, and his heart felt like it might burst out of his chest. This time she moved, slowly. Her head tilted to the side, and she stared directly at him. Her eyes were black, completely black. Ethan's breath hitched. He couldn't move, couldn't think. And then she smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin that sent a wave of cold terror through him. He fumbled to put the car in reverse, his hands shaking violently. The woman didn't move, but her smile widened as if she was daring him to try and escape. The car finally lurched backward, and Ethan hit the gas, not daring to look back. He kept driving, faster and faster, the road blurring around him. And then it happened. A deafening sound, like a piercing scream, erupted from nowhere. His windshield shattered, and the car swerved violently. Ethan screamed as the world spun around him. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the cold ground. The car was gone. The road was gone. He was in the woods, and he wasn't alone. From somewhere behind him, he heard the faintest sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. "Ethan," a voice whispered, low and chilling. He turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. There she was, standing just a few feet away. Her black eyes glistened in the darkness, and her smile remained fixed. "Leave me alone," he yelled, scrambling backward. She tilted her head again, watching him like he was some sort of plaything. "You shouldn't have taken this road," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. And then she was gone. Ethan was left sitting in the dirt, his chest heaving as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. But before he could gather his thoughts, he noticed something strange. A mark on his wrist. It wasn't there before, a symbol etched into his skin, almost like it had been burned there. He stared at it, fear twisting in his stomach. He didn't know what it meant, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not even close. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the mark on his wrist. It was a jagged, circular symbol, uneven and raw, like it had been seared into his skin with something impossibly hot. He rubbed at it frantically, hoping it was dirt, paint, or anything that would come off. But it didn't. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a faint voice. A whisper. "Ethan." His head snapped up, heart pounding. The woman was gone, but the sound of her voice lingered. It wasn't coming from a specific direction. It was everywhere, surrounding him. He stumbled to his feet, his body trembling as adrenaline coursed through his veins. The woods were unnervingly silent now, except for the crunch of his shoes on dead leaves. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to move to get away from whatever had just happened. But the forest wasn't letting him leave. No matter which direction he went, the trees seemed to close in tighter, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the darkness was so absolute that it felt like the night itself was alive. He checked his phone, hoping for a signal. Nothing. The screen flickered strangely before shutting off completely. Then the whispers came again. "Why did you take this road?" It wasn't just the woman's voice this time. There were others. Dozens of them, overlapping, layered with different tones, some loud, some faint. They spoke in a language Ethan couldn't understand, and yet he felt the weight of their words, the malice dripping from each syllable. He clutched his head, squeezing his eyes shut. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice cracking. The whispers stopped. Silence. Ethan opened his eyes cautiously, his breaths ragged. The forest was still, too still. And then he saw it. In the distance, through the gaps in the trees, there was a light. A faint, flickering glow like a fire. It shouldn't have felt comforting, it shouldn't have felt like anything, but Ethan's panic-stricken mind latched onto it as his only hope. He moved toward it, his steps uneven. The closer he got, the more the light seemed to shift, almost like it was moving away from him. But he couldn't stop. He had to know what it was. When he finally broke through the thick underbrush, he froze. There was no fire, no camp. Instead, there was a house. It was old, almost collapsing in on itself, with rotting wooden beams and shattered windows. But the light, it was coming from inside, casting eerie shadows that danced across the cracked walls. Ethan hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to run. But where would he go? The forest wasn't letting him out, and staying here in the open felt just as dangerous. Taking a deep breath, he stepped onto the creaking porch. The boards groaned under his weight, and the air smelled of damp earth and decay. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently as if inviting him in. "Hello?" Ethan called, his voice barely above a whisper. No response. He pushed the door open with trembling hands, the rusted hinges screeching loudly. The light inside was dim, coming from a single oil lamp sitting on a table in the middle of the room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, similar to the one on his wrist. They were carved deep into the wood, some of them smeared with what looked like dried blood. Ethan's stomach churned, but he forced himself to step inside. The air was cold, biting, and the atmosphere felt oppressive, like the house was watching him. The whispers started again, faint but distinct. "Ethan, you're marked." He spun around, searching for the source of the voice. There was no one there. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The door slammed shut behind him, and the lamp flickered wildly. Ethan backed away, his heart hammering. And then he saw her. The woman from the road was standing in the corner, shrouded in darkness. Her black eyes gleamed, and her smile was wider this time, stretching unnaturally across her face. "You shouldn't have come here," she said softly. Ethan's back hit the wall, and his breath came in shallow gasps. "What do you want from me?" he stammered. Her smile faded, and for the first time, her expression shifted. She looked sad. "It's not what I want," she said. "It's what they want." "They?" Ethan echoed, his voice barely audible. The woman tilted her head, her movements jerky, almost puppet-like. "You were warned," she whispered, "but you didn't listen." Before Ethan could respond, the symbols on the walls began to glow, their light pulsating rhythmically. The room filled with a low, droning sound that made his ears ache. The woman's form began to blur, her edges dissolving into the darkness. Her voice echoed, overlapping with the whispers. "They're coming for you, Ethan. And there's nothing you can do." The lamp extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. Ethan's screams echoed in the emptiness, but no one was there to hear them. When the light returned, just barely, Ethan found himself outside again, lying on the forest floor. The house was gone. His wrist burned, and when he looked at it, the symbol had changed. It was no longer a single mark. It had grown, branching out into a complex, sinister pattern. And that's when Ethan realized this wasn't a nightmare he could wake up from. Something was hunting him. Something he couldn't escape. Ethan's mind raced as he stumbled to his feet, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had to get out. He had to escape this cursed place, but he didn't know where he was anymore. The woods felt like they were closing in on him, the trees towering above, their branches reaching down as though to grab him. He glanced at his wrist again. The mark, the symbol, it seemed to be changing, shifting like it was alive. The jagged lines twisted and morphed into something unrecognizable. Was it growing? Was it trying to tell him something? The whispers. They were louder now, surrounding him from every angle. The voices were distorted, incoherent, yet somehow they felt familiar. Each syllable sent chills down his spine, the words twisting in his mind. "You shouldn't be here, Ethan." A voice, her voice, drifted through the trees again, barely audible but unmistakable. He knew it was her. The woman. The one who had been haunting him since the night he took the wrong road. "They're coming?" Ethan's breath quickened. The air grew heavier, thick with an unnatural coldness that seemed to seep into his very bones. He turned in a circle, panic rising in his chest, his body trembling with a mix of fear and confusion. He wasn't sure what to do anymore. He had no answers, only questions. Who were they? Why had she said he was marked? What was the purpose of the symbol that now dominated his wrist, creeping up his arm, as if something inside him was pushing outward, clawing to get free? His legs buckled beneath him as the dizziness took over. For a moment, the world spun, and he thought he might pass out. He caught himself, grabbing onto a nearby tree for support. And then, he heard something else. A sound far off, deep within the woods. A low, rumbling growl, almost animalistic in its ferocity. It was distant at first, but the more Ethan listened, the louder it became. It wasn't a typical animal. It was wrong. It was something inhuman. He stood frozen, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. The growl grew louder, the trees shaking with the force of whatever was coming. It was as if the woods themselves were trembling in fear. And then he saw it. A shadow slithering between the trees, moving with a speed that made his blood run cold. Ethan's stomach twisted in dread as the figure drew closer, its outline impossible to define. All he could make out was a silhouette, tall and thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. It was coming for him. He turned, instinctively running, his feet carrying him through the darkened woods with no clear direction. His lungs burned with each breath, his legs aching from the unrelenting sprint. But no matter how fast he ran, the shadow was always there, just behind him, following at a pace that was too perfect. He wasn't escaping it. The ground beneath him shifted, and his foot caught on something. A root, a rock, he wasn't sure, and suddenly he was falling. The world spun, and he hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of him. He scrambled to get up, but it was too late. The shadow was upon him. Its presence suffocated him, like the very air around him had been sucked dry. The whispers, now louder and clearer than ever, filled his mind. "Run, Ethan, run." But it was no use. Ethan looked up, and there it was. The thing standing over him, its features now visible in the moonlight. Its face, if it could even be called that, was a twisted, gaping maw. Eyes that were nothing but black voids, absorbing everything around it. Its mouth stretched wide, lined with rows of jagged teeth that seemed to shimmer with a sickly, glowing light. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to move, tried to escape, but his body felt paralyzed, as if the thing's presence alone had frozen him in place. It leaned in closer, and he could feel its cold breath on his face, foul and unnatural. Its eyes locked onto his, and for a moment he could see something in them. A deep, unsettling hunger. A thirst for something he couldn't understand. Before he could react, the creature opened its mouth wide, and the ground beneath Ethan seemed to tremble. The shadows around him grew thicker, darker, swirling into an abyss. And then, as if something snapped in his mind, a voice screamed inside him. The mark. His wrist, the symbol, was glowing. In an instant, the shadow recoiled, its body contorting violently as if it were being pushed away by an invisible force. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched wail that made Ethan's skin crawl. The ground cracked open beneath them, and the creature's form dissolved into the darkness, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. Ethan lay there, gasping for air, his body shaking uncontrollably. His wrist throbbed, the symbol now burning against his skin, but the immediate danger had passed. The creature was gone. He pulled himself to his feet, disoriented, still trying to catch his breath. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. What was that thing? What had just saved him? Was it the mark? And the most terrifying question of all, why had it been after him? The woods around him were silent now, eerily so. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond his sight, was undeniable. The whispers came again. "They're not finished with you, Ethan." Ethan turned sharply, searching the darkness for any sign of movement. He was not alone. The thing had gone, but there was something else. Something waiting for him. The whispering voices grew louder, each one more insistent. "You're marked, Ethan. You can't run. You can't hide." He glanced down at his wrist once more, the symbol pulsing under his skin, and with it, the dread of knowing that he was in deeper than ever before. There was no going back. He had no choice now. He had to uncover the truth, what this mark meant, who was behind it, and how it was connected to the terrifying things he had seen. Because the longer he waited, the closer they would get. The road ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. Ethan wasn't alone anymore. The darkness around Ethan felt like it was suffocating him. Every sound, every breath, seemed magnified in the oppressive silence. The woods were unnaturally still, almost waiting. His pulse throbbed in his ears, but his mind was racing, overwhelmed with what had just happened. The creature, the mark, the whispers, it was all connected, but how? Why was he the one being hunted? Was there something inside him now? Something that had awakened when that strange symbol appeared? Ethan ran his fingers over the mark again, feeling the strange warmth emanating from it. The pattern was constantly shifting, its jagged edges flickering like they were alive. Each time he looked at it, it felt like it was growing stronger, more pronounced, as though it was part of him now. A noise, a snap of a twig, pulled him out of his thoughts. His head whipped around, his heart leaping into his throat. It was a person. A man standing between the trees watching him. Ethan's breath hitched. There was something off about him. The man's face was pale, almost gaunt, his features sharp and unnatural. His clothes were torn as if he'd been through something horrific. But the strangest thing of all was his eyes. There were no pupils, only empty white orbs that seemed to stare right through him. The man didn't move, just stood there, silent and still. Ethan's instinct screamed at him to run, to get away from this person who didn't seem human. But his feet were frozen to the ground, like some invisible force was holding him in place. "Who are you?" Ethan's voice was shaky, barely audible. The man's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "I could ask you the same thing, Ethan," he said, his voice low, raspy. Ethan blinked, confused. "How do you know my name?" The man tilted his head, his eerie smile never wavering. "I know more than just your name, Ethan. I know what's coming for you. I know what you've become." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. His first instinct was to bolt, but the man's presence, his calmness, his certainty, seemed to command the air around them. Who are you?" Ethan repeated, though he wasn't sure if he really wanted to know the answer. The man stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he was measuring each step. He stopped just a few feet from Ethan, his eyes still blank, unblinking. "I'm someone who's been where you are," he said, his voice sending a cold shiver through Ethan's bones. "I've been marked. I've been hunted. And I've learned the truth." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "The truth?" The man nodded, his smile widening. "The mark. It's not just a symbol. It's a curse. And it means you're part of something much bigger than you can imagine. Something ancient. Something evil." Ethan felt a surge of panic rise in his chest. "What are you talking about?" What evil? The man's face twisted into a grim expression. You think this is a random thing? That you were just unlucky? No, they've been watching you. The moment you took that road, the moment you saw her, they knew you'd be theirs. Ethan's head was spinning. Who is she? The woman? What does she have to do with this? The man's smile faded and his eyes narrowed. She's their emissary, the one who marks those who are chosen, those who are meant to serve. Ethan recoiled, the words chilling him to his core. Serve? What do you mean? The man's expression grew darker. You're marked, Ethan. You have no choice now. They're coming for you. You'll be dragged into their world, and you'll have to face them. Face who? Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. The man stepped closer, so close now that Ethan could smell the putrid scent of decay on him. The ones who live beyond the veil, beyond what you understand. They've always been here, waiting for the right time to take what's theirs. And now they found you. Ethan's head was spinning. His mind couldn't process it all. He wanted to scream, to run, to escape from this nightmare, but he felt trapped. Every word the man spoke was like a weight, pressing him deeper into the abyss. I don't understand, Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. What do they want with me? The man's face softened as if he pitied him. It's not about you, Ethan. You're just the vessel. The mark, it's the key. You've been chosen to bring them through. You'll be the one who opens the door. Ethan took a step back, shaking his head. No, this can't be real. But the man's eyes never wavered, never blinked. He was unyielding, a terrifying presence that seemed to hold all the answers Ethan didn't want to hear. Real? The man's voice turned cold. It's more real than you could ever imagine. The mark is just the beginning. They'll come for you, Ethan. And when they do, there's no running, no hiding. Ethan could barely breathe. He felt like the ground beneath him was giving way, like everything he had known was slipping into some horrible, twisted version of reality. Before he could speak again, the man's figure began to blur, to distort, as though he was being swallowed by the darkness around him. Remember, the man's voice echoed, fading. It's already begun. Ethan stood there, paralyzed, unable to move or speak. The man was gone, vanished into the night, leaving only his words behind. The silence that followed was unbearable. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest, the weight of the man's warning crushing him. The mark on his wrist burned again, the symbol pulsing with a life of its own. He could feel it. The presence, the pull, the inevitable truth that he had no escape. They were coming, and they wouldn't stop until they had him. The forest seemed to press in around Ethan as he stumbled forward, his mind in chaos. His legs ached, his body trembling from the cold sweat that soaked his shirt, but it wasn't the physical exhaustion that weighed him down. No, it was the man's words, the chilling realization that he was now part of something far bigger, far darker, than he could have ever imagined. The mark on his wrist burned again, its pulsing warmth intensifying with each step. Ethan tried to ignore it, tried to push the thought from his mind, but it was impossible. The mark wasn't just a symbol, it was a key, and now he was the one who had to unlock something. But what? His breath came in shallow gasps, and he clutched his wrist tightly, as though trying to stop it from doing whatever it was destined to do. But the mark didn't listen. It kept growing, changing, shifting in ways that were impossible to understand. The whispers came again. It was a sound he could no longer escape. They were always there now, lingering just at the edge of his thoughts, like a chorus of voices that never stopped. Some were too faint to make out, others clearer, but each one sent a ripple of unease through him. You don't have much time. They're coming, Ethan. You've been chosen. He stopped in his tracks, looking over his shoulder. He thought he had heard something. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, trailing behind him. But when he turned, there was nothing. Just the same endless stretch of trees and darkness. The night seemed to consume everything, leaving him with nothing but the feeling of being watched, hunted. Ethan turned back and pressed forward, the need to escape, to find answers, pushing him onward despite the fear gnawing at his gut. He needed to understand what was happening. He needed to know who had chosen him, why he had been marked, and what the hell that man had meant by opening a door. And then, as if his thoughts had summoned it, the wind picked up. The trees above him groaned, their branches bending like they were straining under some invisible weight. The air grew heavier, denser, as if something was gathering around him. A low rumble filled the distance, too far off to be thunder, too alive. A scream. Ethan froze, the sound cutting through the night, sharp and desperate. It echoed off the trees, bouncing around him in every direction. It wasn't human. It was something other. His blood ran cold. He took a hesitant step forward, his breath catching in his throat. "Hello?" he called, his voice thin, unsure. "Is someone there?" But no answer came, just more whispers, more rustling in the trees. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he turned in a slow circle, trying to catch any sign of movement. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming closer, that the air was thick with some hidden presence. The trees, the wind, the very ground beneath him, it was all part of something he didn't understand. Then the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy footsteps, came from behind him. Before he could react, a figure stepped out from between the trees. At first, Ethan couldn't believe his eyes. It was her. The woman, the one whose voice had haunted him since this nightmare began. The one who had warned him, the one who had spoken to him through the whispers. But now she was here in the flesh. Her long, dark hair was tangled, her face pale and gaunt, as if she had been through something terrible. Her eyes were wide, unnaturally wide, with dark circles underneath, as though she hadn't slept in days. Her clothes were torn, stained with something dark. But it was her eyes, the same hollow, almost lifeless eyes, that struck Ethan with pure dread. She took a step forward, her movements slow, deliberate, as though every inch she moved was carefully calculated. Her lips parted, and her voice came out in a whisper, like the wind itself had spoken. "Ethan, it's too late. You've already started it." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Started what?" His voice cracked. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, her eyes flickered to his wrist, and a dark smile twisted at the corners of her mouth. "You don't know yet, do you?" she murmured, almost to herself. "You don't understand the weight of what's happening. The door is opening, Ethan. You are opening it." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He reached for his wrist instinctively, but the mark seemed to pulse under his touch, almost like it was alive. "I didn't choose this. I don't want this." The woman's gaze hardened, her voice colder now. "You didn't choose it, no. But now you're bound to it. The moment you saw me, the moment you were marked, you became a part of this." She stepped closer, and Ethan instinctively took a step back. He had to get away from her. She was too much, too strange, too eerie. Something about her didn't feel human anymore. Her smile faded, replaced with something more serious, more intense. "You need to understand, Ethan. The mark is not just a symbol. It's a call. It's what's drawing them closer. You've awakened them, and now you can't stop it." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean by them? Who's coming?" She didn't answer. Instead, her eyes flickered to the woods behind him, her face paling. "They're almost here," she said quietly, as though to herself. "It won't be long now. The veil is thinning, and once it's gone..." Her voice trailed off, and she turned sharply, her body jerking unnaturally as if pulled by some unseen force. She was gone in an instant, swallowed by the night as if she had never been there at all. Ethan stood frozen, his body still shaking, but now he knew what he had to do. He had to find the door. He had to stop whatever was coming before it was too late. But he had no idea how. He glanced at his wrist again. It was pulsing, the mark glowing faintly in the darkness. Whatever it was drawing him closer to something. And as he stood there in the dead of night, the first real truth hit him. The hunt was only just beginning. The air felt different now, heavy and thick with an energy Ethan couldn't explain. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves seemed amplified, as though the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting. Ethan knew he couldn't stay here much longer. He had to move. He had to understand what was happening. He glanced down at the mark again. Its glow had intensified, the swirling design on his wrist almost mesmerizing now, like a flame beckoning him forward. The whispers had grown louder too, their voices threading together in a chorus of uncertainty, fear, and something darker. He tried to shut them out, but they were impossible to ignore. "They're coming. Can you feel it? You're not safe. Not anymore. The door is open. It's too late to stop it now." The words echoed in his mind, the weight of their meaning pressing on him. But he had no choice. He had to keep moving. Ethan walked briskly, his eyes darting around the trees as if expecting something to leap out at him at any moment. The night was so still, so unnervingly quiet now, it almost felt like the forest was holding its breath. waiting for something. He didn't want to find out what. His mind kept going back to the woman, her eyes, her voice. She had warned him, but her words didn't make sense. The mark is a call. A call to what? Who were they? And what was this door she had spoken of? The forest seemed to shift, the trees becoming denser, the path narrowing. Ethan slowed, unsure if he was going the right way. But something in his gut told him he was being led somewhere specific. There was no going back now. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet seemed to shake slightly. The faintest rumble, so subtle that at first he thought it was just the nerves in his body reacting to the tension. But then the air grew colder, much colder. A biting chill that gnawed at his skin, seeping through his jacket. It wasn't natural. Ethan's eyes scanned the horizon. Something was moving, slowly, deliberately, off in the distance. A figure. At first, he couldn't make out the details. It was too far away. But as it drew closer, he could see the outline of a man, tall and broad, moving with purpose. His face was obscured by shadows, but Ethan could feel the weight of his presence, the dark energy that seemed to surround him. Then the whispers started again, more frantic this time, overlapping one another like they were speaking all at once. Run, run. They're here. They're close. Ethan froze, instinctively taking a step back. The figure was closer now, much closer. He could see the faint outline of its face, but there was something wrong about it. Its features were distorted, twisted in a way that made his stomach churn. The figure didn't have any eyes, just empty sockets, black as midnight. And its mouth. Ethan swallowed hard. The figure's mouth was wide open, stretching unnaturally far, like it had been forced to smile against its will. Who are you? Ethan's voice was hoarse. The figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. The same symbols he had seen on his wrist. The figure stopped just in front of him, its presence overwhelming. Ethan's heart raced, a rush of cold sweat breaking out on his skin. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words stuck in his throat. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. And then the figure spoke. You've opened the door, Ethan. Now you must face the consequences. The voice was low, gravelly, as if it came from deep within the earth itself. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. What do you want from me? His voice was barely a whisper. Why me? The figure didn't answer immediately. It only tilted its head slightly, its gaze piercing through him, like it could see into his very soul. Then it raised one long skeletal hand, pointing to the center of the square. Ethan followed the gesture, his gaze falling on the cracked stone beneath his feet. He took a step closer, almost unwillingly, and as he did, the ground seemed to shift. A crack appeared, long and jagged, splitting the stone like a wound in the earth. The figure spoke again, its voice now a whisper in the wind. This is the point of no return, Ethan. Once you step across, there is no going back. The door you've opened cannot be closed. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he looked down at the crack. From within it, something glowed, faint like the mark on his wrist, but more intense, more alive. He could feel it pulling him. He could feel the weight of the choice he had to make. The whispers came again, louder this time. It's not too late. You can still turn back. You can still fight it. But in the pit of his stomach, Ethan knew the truth. There was no fighting it. There was no turning back. The door had been opened, and whatever was on the other side had already begun to slip through. He took a breath, bracing himself for what was to come. With one last look at the figure, he stepped forward, crossing the crack in the stone. And as he did, everything went dark. Story 3. The house was quiet, too quiet. I had always thought of silence as peaceful, a break from the constant noise of the world. But that night, it felt like something more, something oppressive. The kind of silence that makes you look over your shoulder as though something is just behind you, watching. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders as the chill in the air seeped into my bones, and I walked into the attic. The attic was the last place I wanted to be, but there I was. The new house needed work, old furniture to be sorted, boxes to be emptied, and as usual, I found myself drawn to the musty corners of the house. The attic was the final frontier, the place that had been untouched since the house had been built. The previous owners had left everything behind. Faded books, forgotten trinkets, and dusty furniture. I had thought about throwing most of it away, but there was something strange about the attic. Something off. I flicked on the small light, and the harsh fluorescent glow illuminated the forgotten space. The smell of old wood and paper hit me like a wall, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. It was as if the attic itself had been waiting for me, waiting for someone to disturb its long-held peace. I pushed aside the creeping feeling and focused on the task at hand. The boxes were piled high against one wall, filled with things no one had bothered to take when they moved out. The old owners had left in a hurry, or so it seemed. There was nothing too remarkable about any of the items in the boxes, until I reached one particular corner. In the farthest corner of the attic, half hidden behind a stack of old newspapers, I saw something strange. A small black cassette tape. It was an odd thing to find in such a place, considering no one had used tapes for years. But this wasn't any ordinary tape. There was no label on it, nothing to identify its contents. Just a plain black cassette with a message scrawled in thick, uneven red ink. Do not play. I don't know why, but I felt a shiver run down my spine when I saw those words. It was almost as if they had been written just for me. But why? Who had left this message? And why had they bothered to leave it in such an old, forgotten part of the house? I could have just left it there. It would have been the smart thing to do, wouldn't it? But curiosity, that dangerous force, had already gripped me. I picked up the tape, the weight of it surprisingly light in my hands. I had to know what it was. It couldn't just be a regular tape. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure it wasn't forgotten. Someone had wanted to send a message. I walked over to the old cassette player in the corner of the attic. It was a relic from another time, dusty and covered with cobwebs. The buttons were stiff, but they still worked. I slid the tape into the player, pressing play with a mix of excitement and dread. For a moment, nothing happened, just the usual static. I waited, the seconds stretching out like an eternity. Then, very faintly, I heard something. At first, it was just a whisper. Hard to make out, almost as if the tape were malfunctioning. But then it became clearer. It wasn't just static. It was a voice. Get out. The words were faint, barely audible, but they were there. I jerked back, my heart hammering in my chest. Was it a joke? A prank left behind by the previous owners? But why would they do that? And who would record such a thing? I pressed my ear closer to the speakers, my hands trembling. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just a weird sound on the tape. But no, the voice came again. Get out. Get out while you still can. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I pulled the tape out immediately, but the voice lingered in my mind. Was I hearing things? I looked around the attic, expecting to see something. But no, the room was still. Silent, save for the occasional creak of the house settling. But I knew I had heard it. The voice was real. It was as if something, had been trying to warn me. But what did it mean? What did it want me to get out of? I sat there for a moment, the tape in my hands, unsure of what to do. Maybe it was a relic of some past time, a ghostly message from someone who had lived here before. Maybe it was just an old, forgotten recording of someone's desperation. But what if it wasn't? What if it was something more? I couldn't stop thinking about the words. Get out. I felt a chill run through me again. I should have put the tape away, thrown it back into the corner of the attic, and never looked back. But I didn't. I couldn't. My curiosity gnawed at me like an insistent whisper, a voice that I could never ignore. I slid the tape back into the player, this time with more caution, more trepidation. I didn't want to hear that voice again, but I had to. I needed to know what it was. I pressed play once more. The static returned, but this time, it didn't stay for long. There was a pause, a long, unnatural pause, and then a low, raspy sound came through the speakers. It was like someone was breathing heavily, but there was something wrong about it. It wasn't just breathing. There was something else. And then the voice came back, but it was different. More urgent. More real. You shouldn't have played it. The words sent a jolt of fear through my body. I yanked the tape out again, my heart racing in my chest. What had I just heard? What was happening? The room felt colder now. I looked around, but again there was nothing, no one. Just me. Alone with the tape and the voice. But the worst part? It wasn't the voice itself. It was the silence that followed. The silence that felt thick and oppressive, as if the air itself had changed. It was as if something had shifted in the house, as if something had awakened. I was standing there, trembling, the tape still in my hands, when I heard it. A knock. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Someone was at the door. The sound echoed up the stairs, and for a moment I was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. Who could be at the door? It was past midnight. I slowly made my way down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what to expect, but when I opened the door, there was nothing. No one. I closed it quickly, locking it behind me, my mind racing. Was I losing my mind? Was the tape affecting me more than I realized? I glanced at the clock, 12:30 a.m. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. It didn't make sense. And that's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, heavy. The sound of boots on the floor above me, as if someone was walking around the attic. But I was certain no one else was in the house. I rushed upstairs, my heart thudding in my chest, and I flung open the attic door, but there was no one there. Just the same old dust and forgotten memories. Yet the tape was still there. The words "do not play" burned into my mind. The next few days passed in a blur, each one feeling longer than the last. I couldn't stop thinking about the tape, the voice, the warning. It lingered in my mind like a dark cloud, following me everywhere I went. Every time I glanced at the attic door or heard the faint creak of floorboards, my heart would skip a beat, as though something was waiting, watching. I tried to go about my day, forcing myself to be normal, to get back to the mundane tasks of unpacking and settling into the house. But it was impossible. The house felt different now. The walls seemed thicker, the shadows darker. I began to notice things I hadn't before. Little things. At first, I thought I was imagining it, like the way the light flickered in the hallway at night, or how the temperature dropped suddenly in the living room, no matter how much I tried to adjust the thermostat. And then there were the whispers. It started one evening just after dinner. I had been cleaning up in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I heard it. A faint murmur, like voices talking in the next room. But when I went to check, there was no one there. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the old house settling, the walls creaking as they always did. But it happened again the next night, and the next. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. The house was old after all. The kind of place that had its own noises, its own little quirks. But then the whispers started to feel too real, too close. They weren't just random sounds. I could make out words now, fragments of sentences that seemed to slip through the walls and into my ears. Help me. He's coming. You have to leave. I would rush through the rooms looking for the source of the noise, but every time there was nothing. No one. Just the silence of the empty house, like it was mocking me. It didn't take long for me to realize that it wasn't the house that was making the noise. It was something else. Something more sinister. The tape. The voice. It was like whatever was in the tape was trying to reach out to me. And I was just getting started. That night, I sat in the living room, the lights dim, the shadows creeping along the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent, as if someone, or something, was just behind me, breathing down my neck. I stood up, suddenly feeling claustrophobic, and made my way to the kitchen. But as I passed the hallway, I froze. There, standing at the end of the hall, was a figure. It was too dark to make out the details, but I could see it clearly enough. A tall, shadowy figure. The outline of a person just standing there, watching me. I called out, my voice shaking. Hello? Who's there? No response. Just the figure, unmoving, like it was waiting for something. Waiting for me. I took a hesitant step forward, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My eyes were fixed on the shadow, unable to look away. It was like I was rooted to the spot. But before I could take another step, it vanished. Like smoke, it just disappeared into the air, leaving nothing behind. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what had just happened. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it a trick of the light? A hallucination? No, it felt too real. It felt too wrong. I rushed down the hall and turned on every light, every lamp, trying to push away the darkness, trying to make sense of what I had seen. But the house remained quiet, too quiet. That night I barely slept. I kept my eyes on the door, listening to the house, waiting for the whispering to return. It never did. The next day I decided to investigate. I couldn't keep living in fear. I needed answers. I had to know what was going on. I went back to the attic, determined to find something, anything that could explain the strange happenings. Maybe there was something I missed, some clue that would connect the tape, the voice, and the shadowy figure. The house was hiding something, I was sure of it. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the weight of the silence around me. The attic was just as I left it, dark, dusty, and filled with forgotten memories. I started sifting through the boxes again, this time looking for something more specific. Maybe a journal, a letter, anything that might give me some insight into what was happening. I found nothing at first. Old clothes, books, papers, junk. But then, buried beneath a stack of yellowed newspapers, I found something that caught my eye. It was another tape. This one wasn't like the first, though. It was different. It was new, well, newer than the other one. It didn't have the same eerie warning written on it, but there was something about it that felt wrong, like it was meant for me to find. Without thinking, I slid it into the tape player, my hands shaking as I hit play. The static crackled for a moment, and then, again, the voice. "You shouldn't have come back." The words echoed in my mind. They were colder, more threatening than the first tape. A warning, a promise, and then the voice whispered something that sent a chill through my entire body. "You can't leave now." I froze. The room seemed to darken. The temperature dropped, and I could feel the air become heavier around me. Something was in the room with me. I wasn't alone. Suddenly, the light flickered. The shadows along the walls twisted, bending and shifting like they were alive. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't see anything. Not clearly, but the feeling was undeniable. Something was watching me. Something was waiting. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. The tape had been a mistake. Whatever was on it, whatever was connected to it, it wasn't just some old prank. It was real. It was here, and it wanted me to stay. I grabbed the tape and yanked it out of the player, but the voice didn't stop. It kept going, reverberating in my head, getting louder and louder until I couldn't hear anything else. "Get out. You shouldn't have played it." I didn't need to hear any more. I ran down the stairs, my feet pounding against the wooden floors. The whispers followed me, echoing in my mind. The voice was everywhere now, not just in the house but inside my head, taunting me, warning me. I slammed the door to the attic shut and locked it behind me, gasping for air. But it wasn't enough. I could still feel the presence, the weight of it pressing down on me. The house wasn't just haunted by memories. It was haunted by something else. Something dark. Something that had been waiting for someone like me to come along. But I didn't know what to do. How could I leave when the house felt alive? How could I escape when the very walls seemed to close in around me? I didn't know how much longer I could stay. But I also didn't know how much longer I could run. The nightmares began the night after I heard the voice on the second tape. They weren't like any nightmares I had ever had before. There was no clear beginning, no comforting waking from them. It was more like I had drifted into an endless, waking nightmare where the lines between reality and dream were no longer clear. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows, dark, twisting figures creeping along the walls. They weren't human. At least, not in any way I understood. They moved in unnatural ways, slithering across the floor like liquid, their forms flickering in and out of view, as if they were aware of me and were deliberately avoiding being seen. I could hear their whispers too. Soft at first, then growing louder until it felt like they were all around me, whispering my name. "Leave, you don't belong here." It felt like a warning. But worse, it felt like a command. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the faint smell of something rotting in my nose. I blinked into the darkness, the house eerily still. My mind was racing. I had to calm myself. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just a nightmare. Nothing more. But something deep inside me knew it wasn't. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It had become a prison, a place where reality itself bent and twisted in ways I couldn't explain. I got out of bed, desperate to distract myself from the thoughts swirling in my mind. The house was dark, the silence thick and suffocating. I made my way down the stairs, my bare feet echoing on the hardwood floors. It was still early, around 3 in the morning, but I couldn't stand being alone in that bedroom. I needed something to distract me, to ground me in the here and now. The kitchen was empty, save for the dim glow of the refrigerator light. I opened it, reaching for a bottle of water, but as my hand brushed the cold plastic, I heard it again. A soft rustling sound, like something moving just out of sight. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound came from the living room. Slow, deliberate, as though someone, or something, was pacing back and forth. My mind raced. Had someone broken in? But I was alone. I had to be. I slowly crept toward the living room, my steps barely making a sound. The rustling continued, punctuated by the soft tap of something, perhaps a foot, hitting the floor. It was so quiet, so subtle, that it felt like my mind was playing tricks on me. I turned the corner into the living room, heart pounding. Nothing. The room was empty, just as I expected. I let out a shaky breath, my nerves on edge. But something didn't feel right. The room wasn't just empty. It felt different, cold, almost There was an oppressive weight in the air, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Then I saw it. It was faint at first, but I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light or the usual play of shadows from the furniture. It was darker, deeper, like the space in the room had somehow bent around it, creating a void where there should have been nothing. I blinked and it was gone. No, I hadn't imagined it. I could still feel it there, lingering just beyond the edge of my vision. My hands shook as I reached for the light switch. The overhead light flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. For a moment, everything was still, the only sound my racing heartbeat. Then the whisper came again. It was closer this time. Leave? The voice was like a low growl, an unnatural rasp that seemed to scrape against my ears. I spun around, but the room was empty. No figure, no shadow. Just the oppressive silence that filled every corner. I didn't stay to find out what else it had to say. I bolted back up the stairs, my feet clumsy and frantic as I scrambled to my bedroom. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me. My heart was still pounding in my chest, but I tried to steady my breathing. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But then something worse happened. I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway. They were getting closer, moving towards my door. I pressed my back against the bed, my body trembling as I waited, frozen in place. The steps stopped outside my door and I held my breath. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. And then came the knock. Soft, barely noticeable, but there nonetheless. A single, hollow knock, followed by a voice, barely more than a whisper. I know you're in there. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring at the door, too terrified to make a sound. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but I couldn't. The words were stuck in my throat. The voice came again, this time more insistent, more commanding. You can't hide forever. I heard the footsteps retreat, slowly fading into the distance. I didn't move for what felt like hours. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear, each thought spinning faster than the last. Who was it? What did it want? Why was it tormenting me? But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a person at the door. It wasn't something human. The voice, it was different. It was hollow, empty, like it was coming from somewhere far away, like it wasn't of this world. I eventually gathered enough courage to open the door, but when I did, there was nothing. The hallway was empty. There were no signs of anyone having been there. No footprints, no evidence that anyone had ever been in the house. I stumbled back into my room and locked the door again, but the fear was suffocating. The house felt alive now, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake, to slip up. I had no idea who or what was behind these events, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into something I didn't understand. Something ancient. Something evil. The following days felt like a blur of dread. I tried to go about my routine, go to work, run errands, keep things normal, but the whispers were always there in the back of my mind, nagging at me. Sometimes they were faint, barely audible, but other times they were loud, commanding, impossible to ignore. It was like the house itself was slowly unraveling, piece by piece, and I was caught in the middle. And then there was the tapping. It started on the second night after the knock. At first I thought it was just the pipes, but it was more rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was tapping on the walls or the floor just outside my door. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't ignore it. I spent hours staring at the door, waiting for it to open, waiting for whatever was out there to come in. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that I was simply hearing things. But then came the breath. Cold, sharp, and so close that I could feel it against my skin. I spun around, but the room was empty. There was no one there. There was nothing there. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was it real? Was I losing my mind? And then, in the dead of night, came the worst thing of all. A sound I couldn't ignore. A voice, clear and loud, and this time it wasn't a whisper. It was as if someone was standing right next to me, breathing in my ear. You should have listened. And that's when I knew. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a prank. Whatever was in the house wasn't going to let me leave. It was toying with me, breaking me down piece by piece, pushing me towards something I couldn't even begin to understand. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let me go. I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the tapping, the cold breath on the back of my neck, it was driving me to the edge. I was losing myself. The house had become my prison, and every night it felt like the walls were closing in tighter, suffocating me. I had to know what was going on. I had to find out what this place wanted from me. The house's silence was deafening. It was as if it was holding its breath, waiting for me to crack, to finally break. But I wasn't going to give in. I wasn't going to let it win. Not like this. I had spent days researching the house, scouring old records, trying to find any clue, any scrap of information that could explain what was happening to me. The local library had been useless. The internet provided nothing more than vague ghost stories and supernatural folklore. But there had to be something I had missed. That's when I decided to do something drastic. I went to the town's historical society, the kind of place that only the locals knew about, tucked away in an old brick building at the edge of town. It was dusty and quiet, a place where time seemed to stand still. I hadn't been there in years, not since I was a kid, but I remembered it being full of old maps, photographs, and records, everything that might hold the key to understanding the history of the house. The woman at the front desk was friendly enough, but when I mentioned the house, her expression changed. Her eyes widened for a brief moment before she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "You mean the old Devereux house?" she asked, her voice soft, almost like she didn't want to say it aloud. I nodded. "Yes, that's the one." She hesitated for a moment, then motioned for me to follow her. We walked down a narrow hallway to the back room, where the historical records were kept. The air in there felt different, heavier, as if the room itself was holding some kind of secret. "I'll pull up everything we have on the house," she said, flipping through some files. "But I should warn you, some things are better left unknown." I didn't understand what she meant at the time, but I nodded, eager to get to the information. I needed answers. She handed me a stack of old papers and photographs, the edges worn and yellowed with age. There were maps of the town from over a century ago, showing the house as it stood on the outskirts, isolated from the rest of the town. There were pictures of the original owners, the Devereux family, a tall, imposing man with sharp features, and a woman whose smile seemed forced, unnatural. But it was the letters that caught my attention. They were written in the early 1900s, all addressed to someone named Charles Devereux. The first letter was from a woman named Margaret, one of Charles's relatives, and it was dated August 2nd, 1910. The letter was filled with cryptic messages, hinting at things that sounded almost like the paranormal. "I hear strange noises at night," it began. "Footsteps in the halls, tapping at the windows. It's not just the house settling, Charles. It's something else, something watching us. Please, you must come home soon. I'm afraid that whatever it is, it's not going away." I felt my stomach churn. This wasn't just some innocent letter about an old house. This was something darker. Margaret's words were laced with fear, and I could feel her terror rising off the page. The next letter was from Charles himself, written a week later, dated August 9. It was brief, cold. "You are imagining things. The house is old, Margaret. I've told you before. Nothing is here but the wind and the occasional rat. Stop worrying." That was all he said. No acknowledgement of what Margaret had described, no reassurance. Just dismissive, almost callous. I turned the page to find another letter from Margaret, dated September 12th. This one was different. It was desperate. "It's gotten worse. The noises are constant now, and I hear whispering. Not just in the walls, but in my head. I've seen things too. Shadows moving on their own, figures standing at the foot of my bed at night. Charles, I know you don't believe me, but something is in this house. It's not just the wind or the rats. It's something more, something darker. I'm scared, Charles. Please come home." My hands were trembling now. This wasn't just an old letter. This was a cry for help, a warning, one that had been ignored. But the most chilling part was the mention of whispering, of figures standing at the foot of the bed. The same things I had been experiencing. There was no reply from Charles in the records. The letters stopped abruptly, and the next records about the Devereux house were about its sale. Charles had sold the property, and the house passed into other hands. I felt sick. This wasn't just a coincidence. The whispers, the shadows, everything that had been happening to me, it had happened before. And it wasn't just a passing phase. It had happened to the Devereux family. And now it was happening to me. I sat in that dusty room for what felt like hours, going through every page, every letter, every photograph. But there was nothing more. No clear explanation. Just more unanswered questions. Finally, the woman at the front desk came back. "I'm afraid that's all we have. Some things are better left alone." I stood up, my mind racing. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but I still didn't understand the full picture. What was this force? What had driven the Devereux family away? And why was it haunting me now after all these years? As I walked out of the historical society, The weight of the past seemed to settle on my shoulders. The air was thick with tension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The shadows seemed deeper now, darker. The sky had turned a dull gray, as though the world was holding its breath. I had to go back to the house. I had to confront whatever was there. I couldn't let it take me like it had taken the Devereux family. I couldn't let it win. When I arrived home, the house seemed different. The air felt heavier, as though the very walls were pressing in on me. I walked inside, the silence suffocating. There was no sound, no movement, but I could feel something. I could feel it watching me. The whispering started again. Faint at first, like a distant memory. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was closer this time, more insistent. I stood frozen, listening, trying to understand what it wanted. But it didn't speak again. The house was quiet now, too quiet. I knew what I had to do. I ran up to the attic, the place where it all started, the place where the tapes had come from. But when I opened the door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The old tape player was sitting there, but it wasn't empty anymore. Another tape had appeared, this one different from the others. It was marked with a single word: run. I didn't hesitate. I didn't need to hear the tape. I knew it was too late. The house had already claimed me. The moment I saw the tape labeled run, I knew there was no turning back. I had already crossed a line, one I couldn't uncross. Whatever this house wanted from me, whatever darkness had taken root here, it wasn't going to let go easily. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on. I stared at the tape for what felt like an eternity. The word run was a simple command, but it sent a chill through my entire body. My mind raced. Why had this tape appeared now? What did it want me to do? Was it telling me to leave? Or was it a warning that there was something far worse waiting for me if I didn't? I grabbed the tape, my hands trembling as I loaded it into the player. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat reverberating in my ears. For a moment, I thought about throwing it away, ignoring it completely. But something in me, something dark, compelled me to play it. I pressed play. The static crackled through the speakers, and for a moment I thought it was just noise, nothing more. But then a voice emerged from the distortion. A voice that wasn't quite human, yet not fully inhuman either. It was familiar, yet strange, as if it were speaking directly into my mind. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was soft at first, like a murmur in the dark. It sent a cold shiver up my spine, but I couldn't stop myself from listening. It's too late for you. Too late for all of us. The words were almost hypnotic. I could feel them sinking into my skin, curling under my flesh. It was like the house itself was speaking, not just through the tape, but through the very air around me. We tried to escape, but it followed us. It always follows. I felt a jolt of panic. My thoughts scrambled for clarity, but I couldn't grasp onto anything solid. Escape? Had the Devereux family tried to leave? Was that why they disappeared? Was that why this house felt like a prison? The voice continued, growing more desperate with each word. You can't escape. Not from it. Not from what's inside the walls. It feeds on fear. And it's been waiting for someone like you. I recoiled as if the voice had physically struck me. Fear. I had been afraid since I moved into this house, but now I felt it, really felt it, like it was seeping into my bones, poisoning my very thoughts. I wanted to stop the tape, to shut it off, to end it all. But I couldn't. My fingers were frozen to the buttons. I couldn't look away. The house will not let you go. It's feeding on your fear just like it fed on us. The voice paused, and in the sudden silence I thought I heard something moving behind me. A shadow flickered at the corner of my vision. I whirled around, heart racing, but the room was empty. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself, but the voice returned, louder, clearer now. Do you hear it? I froze. The whispering was back. Not in my head this time, but in the room with me. Soft, low, and faint at first, like a far-off murmur, but it quickly grew in intensity, surrounding me from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest. My breath caught in my throat. It was like 100 voices, whispering in unison, calling my name. Run. The voice on the tape sounded more desperate now, almost pleading. You have to leave. It's too strong, too powerful. You can't fight it. It will consume you. The whispering continued. I couldn't tell if it was real or if it was part of the tape, but it didn't matter. The house was alive, and it was feeding. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the floor above. The sound was deafening, shaking the house, rattling the walls. I jumped back, the tape player falling to the ground with a sickening thud. But the whispering didn't stop. It only grew louder, like an army of voices, all pleading, all demanding something from me. I ran. I didn't stop to think. I didn't question what was happening. I bolted for the stairs, my legs moving of their own accord, driven by an instinctual fear that I couldn't control. As I reached the top of the stairs, the air grew heavier. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows darkening, twisting in ways that defied logic. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the air. There was a sound, footsteps. The unmistakable sound of someone walking down the hall towards me. But it wasn't just the sound of footsteps. It was the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of fabric, the shift of weight that made it clear there was someone there, someone moving deliberately as if they were trying to reach me. I turned and ran for the attic. It felt like the only place I could go. Maybe there, in the place where it all began, I would find some kind of answer, some way to end this nightmare. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I ascended, but the noise from the hall was growing louder, closer. I could feel something hot on my neck, something breathing down my spine. When I reached the attic door, I pushed it open with all my strength. The room was dark, the shadows in the corners seeming to stretch and move as if they were alive. I fumbled for the light switch, my hands shaking, but when I flicked it, the light flickered and went out. I stood there in the darkness, listening to the muffled footsteps that seemed to be coming closer, closer, until they were just outside the door. I knew I couldn't go back down. I couldn't face whatever was coming for me. I backed up to the center of the room, feeling the chill of the air surround me. My mind raced, trying to piece together everything I had learned, the voices, the shadows, the tapes. What was it? What was this thing that had haunted the Devereux family, that had followed them and now was following me? A sound broke through my thoughts. The sound of something dragging across the floor. The scraping noise came from the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed thickest. I turned toward it, my heart hammering in my chest, and I saw it. Something shifting in the darkness, something long and thin, moving with an unnatural grace. Then I heard it. A voice. The voice from the tape. But this time it wasn't through the speakers. It was real. I told you. You can't escape. The figure moved closer, and I felt an overwhelming wave of dread wash over me. I could see its outline now. A figure, tall and thin, its features obscured by darkness, its body a mass of shifting shadows. It moved with a strange, jerky motion, as though it wasn't quite human. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My body was frozen in place, my mind a whirl of terror. The figure stepped into the dim light, and I saw it. Its face. But it wasn't a face at all. It was just a hollow void, an empty blackness that seemed to suck in the light around it. And then it spoke again, this time with a voice that was a mixture of the whispering and the command. You are mine now. I stood frozen, paralyzed by fear, as the thing in front of me moved closer, its hollow face staring into my very soul. My heart pounded violently, each beat reverberating in my chest like the sound of war drums, echoing through my bones. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs were no longer under my control. They were like lead, immovable, caught in the grip of something far darker than fear itself. You are mine now, the voice rasped, its echo reverberating in the room like a twisted prayer. It didn't need to raise its voice. It was a simple statement of fact, one that cut through the air like a blade. The creature's movements were deliberate, unnaturally slow, as if it enjoyed the terror it was inducing, savoring the fear that radiated off me. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything, but nothing came. It was as if my voice had been stolen from me, as if the house itself had swallowed every sound that could break the silence of the attic. The figure took another step toward me, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the floor. I could feel its presence pressing in on me from every direction, suffocating, wrapping itself around me like a cold, suffocating blanket. I knew it wanted me. I knew it had been waiting for me. And yet, even as it grew nearer, there was a part of me that refused to give in. There was a flicker, a spark deep within me, the remnants of the person I used to be before all this madness. The fear was overwhelming, yes, but there was something else. Anger. Anger at this thing, at this house, for taking everything from me, for making me question my sanity, for dragging me through this nightmare. I clenched my fists, the only thing I could still control, and I forced myself to speak. The words felt foreign in my mouth, trembling, but they came out nonetheless. What are you? I demanded, my voice hoarse, barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the stillness of the room. The creature's response was not a spoken one. Instead, it tilted its head slightly as if considering my question, and then it moved closer still. Its shadow flickered across the floor like an oil stain spreading, almost organic in its growth. The closer it got, the colder the air around me became, until I could see my breath condensing in the frigid atmosphere. "I am what you fear." The voice was soft, but it reverberated in my chest, rattling the very bones of my body. I could feel the presence of the entity now, not just in the room with me but in the very walls. It was as if the house itself was alive, thrumming with energy, its heartbeat matching the terrifying rhythm of mine. I took a step back, but the thing was relentless, following me as I moved. I stumbled over an old crate in the corner, barely managing to catch myself. The creature didn't move, but its presence grew stronger, heavier. I could feel it, hear it, smell it. Its presence was everywhere. "You cannot escape me," it whispered again, each syllable seeping into my consciousness, pressing against my thoughts, my very soul. I was losing my mind. I could feel it slipping away piece by piece. The more I looked at this thing, the more it felt like it was consuming me from the inside out. The walls around me seemed to close in tighter, the air growing thick with oppressive darkness. I could hear the whispers again, the same ones I had heard when I first moved in, the ones that had been in my head for days, weeks now. Run. I thought of the tape, the warning, the voice from before. It had told me to run, but I had ignored it. And now I was paying the price. I'd been waiting. The creature's voice was sharp now, its tone dripping with venom, with malice. It wasn't just a haunting anymore. It was personal. It had been hunting me, waiting for me to slip up, to walk right into its trap. I felt a surge of terror unlike anything I had ever known. It was pure, unfiltered fear, radiating from the very core of my being. But I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop the shaking, the sweat pouring from my skin, the rapid, shallow breaths that rattled in my chest. And then, as if the entity could sense my fear, it took another step forward. But this time it wasn't just moving. It shifted. It twisted, its form warping, becoming something far more monstrous. The shape that had once been a tall, shadowy figure was now something more grotesque. Its body elongated, contorting in impossible angles. Its arms stretched out, long and skeletal, each finger ending in sharp claws that scraped across the floor with a sickening screech. I wanted to run, to flee, but my body wouldn't obey. It felt like the creature had latched onto me, its presence weighing me down. I couldn't escape. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. I will consume you just as I consumed them." The air in the room grew colder still, the shadows stretching out across the walls, curling like tendrils that reached for me, yearning to pull me into the darkness. I couldn't see clearly anymore. The creature's face was now nothing but a void, a black abyss that threatened to swallow everything in its path. And then something inside me snapped. I wasn't sure where the strength came from. Maybe it was the sheer terror that finally drove me to act. Maybe it was the anger at this thing, at the house that had taken everything from me. Maybe it was the desperation to survive. But in that moment, I knew I had to fight back. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the one thing I hadn't dared to use until now, the lighter. It was an old, tarnished thing, something my grandfather had given me years ago. I wasn't sure why I had kept it. Maybe it was a reminder of a simpler time before all this horror had begun. Before the tapes, before the whispers. But in that moment, it felt like the only thing that could save me. I flicked the lighter, and the tiny flame danced to life in the darkness. The creature recoiled. For the first time, I saw it hesitate. It flinched away from the light, its form flickering like a shadow in the sun. It hissed, a sound like metal scraping against stone. "You think this will stop me?" It hissed, but its voice was no longer certain. It was losing its grip on me, on this place. I took a step forward, keeping the flame in front of me, using it like a shield. "I will stop you," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "I will make you leave." The creature screeched, its form writhing, its shadow snapping like a whip, but the flame held its ground. I could feel the power of the light pushing it back, driving it into the corners of the room, away from me. For a moment, everything stopped. The whispers ceased. The darkness receded. The air, thick with the oppressive presence of the house, began to lighten. I didn't wait. I turned and ran for the door, my legs finally responding to my command. I didn't look back. I didn't dare to. I made it out of the attic and down the stairs. My heart was racing, my thoughts a blur. But when I reached the door, I didn't stop. I pushed it open and ran out into the night, into the cold air. The moment I stepped outside, I felt the weight lift from my chest. The house was behind me, silent once again. But as I looked back, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The house was still there. Its silhouette stood against the dark sky, but there was something different. A shape moved behind the window, a shadow watching me. And I knew then, in the pit of my stomach, that this was far from over. The creature wasn't gone. It wasn't finished with me. It was just getting started. I kept running, but each step felt like I was running against a force far greater than just the wind or the strain on my body. My legs ached as I pushed through the underbrush, the sharp branches scratching at my face and arms, but nothing could deter me. The forest, which once seemed like a peaceful refuge, now felt like a prison. Its dense trees and tangled thickets closing in, its shadows stretching out toward me with malicious intent. I couldn't stop. I had to get away from that place, from that house that had become a living nightmare. The images of the creature from the attic still haunted my mind, its hollow eyes, its monstrous form shifting and flickering like a broken shadow. It had been there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I knew it wasn't over. I knew it was only a matter of time before it found me again. The sound of my breath filled my ears, ragged and uneven, but it was the silence of the forest that unnerved me the most. The usual sounds of wildlife, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, had all fallen eerily silent. It was as though the very woods were holding their breath, watching me run. And then, as if to break the silence, I heard it, a low growl. At first, I thought it was just the wind, the creak of a branch. But then it came again, louder this time, like the rumble of something far more sinister, something that didn't belong to the natural world. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped in my tracks, my body frozen in fear. The growl wasn't coming from any animal I knew. It was low, deep, and full of malice, vibrating through the air like the hum of a distant thunderstorm. It was a growl that spoke of hunger, of something relentless, something that couldn't be reasoned with or outrun. My skin prickled with the unmistakable sense of being hunted. I turned slowly, looking into the shadows between the trees. The darkness seemed to shift, moving like something alive, something that was watching me. I could feel its eyes on me, its gaze burning into the back of my skull, crawling into my thoughts, making my body feel heavy with dread. The growl echoed again, closer this time, a low, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. I wanted to run. I should have run. But the fear paralyzed me. I couldn't tell if it was the fear of the thing in the darkness or the fear of going back to the house that had trapped me in its twisted nightmare. I was caught between two horrors, each one equally unbearable. And then, from the depths of the shadows, it appeared. Not in the form I had seen before in the attic, but something else. A massive, monstrous shape, its silhouette darker than the surrounding night. It loomed at the edge of my vision, moving slowly, deliberately, its twisted limbs stretching unnaturally long. The creature was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was part of them, a creature that belonged to the dark. I could see its glowing eyes now, faint and distant, yet still piercing through the darkness like twin points of flame. They locked onto me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. There was no mistaking it now. It was the thing from the house. It had followed me. "You can't escape me," it whispered, its voice a sickening hiss that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my feet. The words were not just spoken. They were felt, like the pressure of 1,000 hands on my chest, crushing the breath from my lungs. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The fear was so strong now that it had seeped into my very bones. It wasn't just the thing in front of me, it was everything around me. The trees, the forest, the very ground beneath my feet. Everything was closing in. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest, but the creature didn't move. It stood there watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I didn't know what to do. What could I do? The house had marked me, and now this thing, this nightmare, was hunting me just like it had hunted the others before me. And then I remembered the lighter. The one I had kept from the attic, the one that had briefly repelled the creature when I had first encountered it. The tiny flame that had driven it back, if only for a moment. It was all I had. It was my only hope. I reached into my pocket with trembling fingers, my heart pounding so loudly that I thought it might give me away. My hand brushed against the metal, and I pulled it out, my eyes not leaving the creature for even a second. I clicked it once, twice, and then the small flame sputtered to life. It wasn't much. The light was weak, fragile, but it was enough. The creature recoiled. It wasn't expecting this. Its glowing eyes flickered, and I saw its form twitch as though it were being pulled back by an unseen force. It hissed, its mouth opening wide in what looked like an attempt to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the night, drowned out by the light of the flame. I held the lighter out in front of me, trying to steady my hand. The creature screeched, its voice sharp and grating, like nails on a chalkboard, and it took a step back, its shadow flickering and warping as it moved. For the first time since this madness had begun, I felt like I had the upper hand. The light was keeping it at bay, but it wasn't enough to defeat it. I knew that. The creature's power came from the darkness, from the fear it spread, and no small flame could banish that. I needed more. I ran. There was no other choice. I couldn't stay here. The creature was reeling, but I could see it gathering its strength, its monstrous form swelling in the shadows. It would come for me again. I pushed through the underbrush, ignoring the sting of the branches that clawed at my skin, the mud that clung to my feet, dragging me down. My mind was racing, thinking of the house, of the old tape, of the warning that had been left behind. Had I been too late? Was this my punishment for not listening? The growling continued to echo in the woods behind me, but it was distant now. The creature wasn't close, yet. I knew it wouldn't stop. It couldn't. It was relentless. It was the embodiment of everything I had feared, and it would follow me until I was no more. I saw the edge of the forest up ahead, a faint line of light that stretched into the horizon. The dawn was breaking, just a sliver of light at the edge of the sky. I was almost there. But as I reached the clearing, something pulled at me, something more powerful than fear. I turned. The house. It stood there, towering in the distance, looming against the pale light of the dawn. The windows flickered, shadows moving behind them, and I could see the thing in the window, its face now clear and unmistakable. It was there watching me, waiting. And I knew then, as the light from the dawn stretched out across the forest, that I couldn't run anymore. The house wasn't just a place. It was alive, and it would never let me go. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, and the flame from the lighter flickered out, leaving me in darkness once again. Story 4. The wind howled through the trees, a chilling wail that seemed almost human. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter around him, the damp air biting through the fabric. The forest was alive with strange sounds tonight. It wasn't just the wind or the rustle of leaves. It was something else, something darker. A sensation that gnawed at his nerves, a feeling that something was watching him. He hadn't meant to come this far into the woods. It all started earlier that evening when he and his friends decided to take a shortcut through the forest, cutting across the old trail they used to follow when they were kids. The town they lived in was small, too small for their tastes, and they'd always found their own ways to entertain themselves. Late-night walks, dares, games of hide-and-seek that stretched well past midnight. But tonight was different. There was an unease in the air that Ethan couldn't shake. As soon as they stepped onto the path, something felt off. It wasn't just the overgrown trees that seemed to loom closer than usual or the thick fog that had begun to creep in. No, it was something deeper, an unsettling presence like an invisible force pushing against them. Still, they kept walking, joking about how silly they were being until one by one they stopped. Ethan's friends couldn't explain it either, but none of them wanted to go further. They were all nervous, their faces pale, and their eyes darting around like prey. But Ethan hadn't been scared. At least, not until he stepped off the trail to take a closer look at something he'd spotted just ahead, a glimmering light. Something was glowing faintly through the trees, just beyond the reach of their campfire's light. His curiosity got the best of him, and he broke away from the group, walking toward the strange glow. He didn't hear them call after him. That's when things began to feel wrong. The trees around him seemed to shift as if they were closing in, the air becoming stiflingly thick, every breath he took like trying to breathe through wet cloth. He continued forward, drawn to the light like a moth to a flame. The deeper he went into the forest, the less he could hear. The wind, the rustling of the leaves, all of it faded. There was only a thick silence that weighed on his chest. The glow grew brighter and Ethan's steps quickened. He wasn't sure why he was so drawn to it, but there was an undeniable pull. And when he finally reached the source, it wasn't what he expected. It wasn't a lantern or some strange animal with glowing eyes. It was a mark, a symbol burned into the bark of a massive oak tree. At first, Ethan thought it was some sort of graffiti. But then he noticed the way the mark seemed to shimmer, as if it were alive, as if the tree itself was breathing it into existence. The symbol was intricate, jagged, and looping, almost hypnotic in its design. It pulsed with an eerie, unnatural light. His hand moved toward it before he could stop himself. As his fingers brushed against the glowing mark, the forest seemed to shift once more, this time violently. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the air went cold, so cold that he could see his breath in the moonlight. The trees groaned and shook, their branches twisting and contorting like skeletal arms trying to break free from their trunks. The distant sound of whispers, so faint he wasn't sure he'd heard them at all, began to creep into his ears. And then, silence. For a moment, it was like the world held its breath. Ethan yanked his hand away from the tree, heart pounding in his chest. He turned back toward the trail, intending to go back to his friends, but his surroundings had changed. What had once been a familiar path now looked foreign. The trees were closer, the shadows longer, and the fog, it had thickened, swirling around his feet like it had come alive. Ethan was no longer on the path. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had wandered too far, too deep into the woods. His breath quickened, his heart raced. He called out to his friends, his voice cracking in the heavy silence. Guys, where are you? No response. Panic set in. He spun around, his mind scrambling to find a way out. But the forest had become a labyrinth, every direction seeming to look exactly the same. His footsteps echoed unervingly loud against the silent trees. Nothing but the cold, pressing quiet surrounded him now. The whispers returned, louder this time, more urgent. Asterisk, turn around. Asterisk, they're coming. Asterisk. Ethan's spine tingled. He wasn't sure if the words were real or if they were just in his head, but something told him that he shouldn't ignore them. But it was too late. The sound of footsteps, heavy, slow, deliberate, reached his ears. They weren't his. They weren't the echo of his own panic-stricken steps. He froze, his heart in his throat. The footsteps grew louder, closer, too close. There was no time to think, no time to wonder who or what they belonged to. He turned, instinctively running deeper into the woods, his legs aching with every step. He had to get away. He had to find his friends. But as he ran, he realized the footsteps weren't following him. They were ahead of him. He wasn't alone. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to outrun whatever was out there, but the sound of the footsteps kept matching his speed, like it was tracking him, waiting for the perfect moment to close in. And then he saw it. In the distance, just beyond a thicket of trees, a figure stood, tall, lurking. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. The figure was too still, too quiet. He couldn't make out its features, but it felt wrong. It felt like it didn't belong there, like it was from somewhere beyond this world. Asterisk, turn back. Asterisk. The voice wasn't a whisper now. It was clear, distinct, as if it came from the figure itself. Ethan felt his body freeze, caught between fear and confusion. He knew he should run. He knew he should leave, but his feet wouldn't obey him. And that's when the figure moved. It took a step forward, its eyes, dark, hollow, finally coming into view. They were empty sockets, black as midnight, and as it moved closer, Ethan felt his body tighten with fear. The ground beneath him seemed to ripple, like it was warping with every step the figure took. Leave now and forget what you saw. The voice was chilling and human, but Ethan couldn't look away. Something inside him urged him to fight, to run, but the forest around him felt like it was closing in, pulling him into its web. And just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. For a moment, Ethan stood there, frozen, unsure if it had been real, if he had imagined it. But then he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of eyes on him, the weight of 1,000 unseen gazes, and the whispering grew louder. Asterisk, you've opened the door. Asterisk, you can't go back. Asterisk. Panic flooded his body as the ground beneath him trembled again, but this time, it wasn't just the earth shifting. It felt like the entire forest was alive, like it was watching him, waiting for something. And Ethan realized too late that whatever it was, it had already begun. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled backward, his breath ragged. The whispering voices, soft at first, now echoed louder in his ears, impossible to ignore. They circled his mind, growing more intense with every second. He didn't understand what was happening or why it was happening to him. All he knew was that he needed to get out. He needed to leave this cursed place before whatever it was that had found him, trapped him here, could finish what it had started. His feet moved faster, his legs moving of their own accord, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He ran, blind, without a destination, but the forest, this forest, felt different. The trees, once familiar, now twisted and contorted in strange shapes, their branches reaching out like clawed hands, waiting to ensnare him. The fog, thick and suffocating, closed in behind him, wrapping around him like a shroud. It felt as though the very earth beneath his feet was working against him. His foot caught on a root, sending him tumbling to the ground with a painful thud. His palms scraped against the rough bark of a tree as he caught himself, but the moment his hand touched the bark, a wave of nausea hit him. His stomach churned violently. He jerked his hand away, but it was too late. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a prison. The whispers rose again, more urgent this time, pressing into his mind. He could hear them clearly now, as if they were speaking to him directly, each word sharp, cold, cutting through the air like a knife. Asterisk, you are marked. Asterisk, asterisk, there is no escape. Asterisk, Ethan's pulse raced. He could feel the weight of their presence around him. Shadows that moved, not in the corners of his vision, but right in front of his eyes. The trees whispered, their limbs creaking and groaning as if they were alive, the earth beneath him shifting like it had a mind of its own. He forced himself to his feet, stumbling in the thickening fog, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The strange light from before flickered ahead, glowing faintly, like a beacon pulling him back to where it all started. The mark, the symbol on the tree. With every step, the world seemed to warp, like he was walking through a dream. The trees began to close in tighter, casting long, twisted shadows over the ground. His legs were aching, his mind exhausted, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let the darkness consume him. Asterisk, you cannot outrun what has chosen you. Asterisk, the voice came again, but this time it was clearer, more powerful. The mark. Ethan's mind raced back to that moment when he had touched it. The strange pull, the way it had made him feel different, like it was calling to him. And then the figure, the thing with hollow eyes. Who are you? He whispered to the air, his voice shaky. He didn't expect an answer, but the whispering grew louder until it seemed to come from all around him. There wasn't just one voice now. There were hundreds, thousands, all speaking at once, filling his mind, suffocating him. Asterisk, we are the ones who watch. We are the ones who wait. Asterisk. Ethan's legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the cold ground. The voices, the whispers, they felt so close now. His chest tightened, and his mind screamed for him to wake up. But this wasn't a nightmare. This was real. And whatever it was, whatever had found him, had already begun to pull him into its depths. He shook his head, struggling to focus. The fog was thick now, clinging to the trees like it was alive, like it had a consciousness of its own. A sudden chill ran down his spine as he looked around, realizing something. The forest was changing again. The path once so familiar was gone. The trees now formed an endless, twisting maze. The sky overhead was dark, the stars completely hidden by a thick layer of clouds. Ethan could feel it now, the weight of the unseen eyes watching him. His heart raced faster as he pushed himself back to his feet, but his body felt heavy, his movements sluggish. There was a new sound now, cutting through the whispering, a low, guttural growl. It didn't come from an animal or anything he could identify. It was more like something else, something ancient. He froze. Something was coming. The fog swirled around him, thickening into something solid, something tangible. The growl came again, closer now. Ethan couldn't see it, but he could feel its presence, its hunger. He felt a ripple in the air, a shift in the atmosphere that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. The forest had become alive, and it was closing in on him. He turned, his breath ragged, and that's when he saw it. At first, it was just a shadow flickering in the corner of his vision, but then it moved, slowly, deliberately. A figure, tall and dark, emerging from the fog. Its shape was impossible to define, its limbs too long, its movements too unnatural. Its presence was suffocating. Ethan could feel his heart race in his chest as the figure took another step, its hollow eyes locked on him. The whispers faded for a moment, as if the figure's presence had silenced them. And in the stillness, the figure spoke. Its voice was low, like the crackling of old wood in a fire, unsettling and deep. Asterisk, you should have turned back when you had the chance. Asterisk. Ethan stumbled backward, his legs trembling beneath him. His hands were shaking as he tried to steady himself, but the figure moved again, closer, its long fingers twitching. He couldn't outrun it. There was no escape. You're marked, the figure repeated, its voice colder now. Asterisk, the door has been opened, and you've already crossed the threshold. You can never return. Asterisk. Ethan felt his stomach twist as the words sank in. He didn't know what it meant, what this mark was, but he knew it was something far worse than he could have ever imagined. His heart hammered in his chest. a feeling of helplessness settling in. The figure's gaze never wavered, its eyes like black voids, swallowing everything they touched. He wanted to scream, but his voice failed him. He wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't move. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The forest was still, the air thick with tension. Ethan stood frozen in place, his heart pounding, his mind reeling. He didn't understand. He couldn't make sense of what had just happened. The whispers were gone now, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, remained. As the fog began to dissipate, Ethan's surroundings came into focus once more. The path, the trees, everything seemed the same, but Ethan knew it wasn't. He had crossed a line. He had opened something he couldn't close. And whatever was hunting him had already begun to track its prey. Ethan's breath came in short, frantic gasps. He stood frozen, staring at the spot where the figure had disappeared, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The forest around him seemed to breathe, the trees shifting and groaning as though they were alive, aware of his every move, every thought. He didn't know where to go or how to escape, but one thing was certain: the darkness had marked him. The figure had marked him. As the fog began to thin, revealing the twisted, gnarled trees once again, the familiar path seemed distant, unreachable. He had no idea where he was anymore. It was as if the forest itself had become a maze, an endless labyrinth designed to trap him. The way he had come was gone. The way forward? Just more trees, more shadows, more creeping unease. His eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, that might offer a way out. But the forest was silent now. Too silent. Even the wind had stopped. There was an unnatural stillness, and it made his skin crawl. He tried to call out, but his voice seemed weak, lost in the vast emptiness of the woods. No answer came. His friends, had they even noticed he was gone? Had they heard his cries? Or had they too disappeared into the fog? Ethan shook his head, trying to focus. He needed to stay calm. He needed to think. The mark. He couldn't stop thinking about it. The symbol on the tree, the way it had pulsed like it was alive. What had it done to him? He touched his skin as if expecting to find it there, some sign, some physical manifestation of the mark. But there was nothing. No symbol burned into his flesh. No glowing trace left behind. Yet the weight of it still clung to him. It was in his blood now, part of him in ways he couldn't understand. As he stood there, shrouded in the thickening fog, the whispers returned. This time they were clearer, louder. They didn't sound like a distant echo anymore. They were here inside his head, inside his mind. Asterisk, you can't escape what has chosen you. Asterisk, asterisk, it sees you. It knows you. Asterisk, Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone anymore. There was something, asterisk, someone asterisk, else out here with him. He could feel it, watching, waiting. The air grew colder, biting at his skin. His feet froze to the ground as an overwhelming sense of dread flooded over him. He wasn't imagining it. The trees weren't just trees anymore. The shadows, those dark, stretching things, were no longer just shadows. They were moving, shifting in the corner of his vision, twisting as though they had their own minds. As if they were reaching out to him, pulling him toward them. He had to move. But where? Ethan turned around, his legs unsteady beneath him. The whispers grew louder, pressing into his ears. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. It was too much. Too fast. And then, just like that, he saw it. The shape in the distance. At first, it was hard to make out. It was just a blur of black against the mist, too far to distinguish any features. But as he stumbled closer, the figure began to take shape. It was tall, too tall, and it was moving toward him, its steps slow and deliberate, the ground trembling beneath its weight. Not again. Ethan's blood ran cold. He wanted to run. He needed to run. But his legs refused to obey, his body rooted to the spot. His mind screamed for him to move, but the figure was getting closer, its shape becoming clearer with every agonizing second. There wasn't just one figure. More shadows emerged from the fog, slithering out from behind the trees like dark smoke, pooling around the first figure, merging with it. They were not human, not in any way he could understand. The air seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive as the group of figures gathered, encircling him. And the voices, the whispers, grew louder, more insistent, almost deafening. Asterisk, you cannot hide. Asterisk, asterisk, you cannot run. Asterisk, Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to scream, to cry out, but his mouth felt dry as if the very air around him was choking him. One of the figures stepped forward, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Ethan couldn't tell where its face was, only that the blackness it wore seemed to swallow all light. Its presence was suffocating. It was too much, too fast. His knees buckled beneath him and he collapsed to the ground. The shadows closed in, surrounding him, their cold, empty eyes fixed on him with terrifying intensity. And then the whisper stopped. The silence was even worse. For a moment, Ethan could hear only his own heart, pounding like a drum in his chest. He dared not look up, terrified that if he did, something worse would meet his gaze. But he could feel them. They were all around him, watching, waiting. "Who are you?" His voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. A shadow in front of him stirred. It seemed to shift, its form solidifying into something, someone more familiar. It wasn't the same figure he had seen before. This one was different, more human in a way. But its eyes, they were hollow just like the first one. "I am the one who watches." The voice was deep, inhuman, like it had come from somewhere else. The words seemed to vibrate in his chest, heavy and cold. "I am the one who waits for those who are marked." Ethan could feel the air grow colder as the figure knelt in front of him, its face impossibly close. He wanted to scream, to push it away, but his body was frozen, his limbs refusing to move. "You opened the door, and now you belong to us." The figure's cold, empty eyes bore into his, and for the first time Ethan felt the full weight of what that meant. Whatever was happening to him, it was no longer just about him. It was about something much larger. Something that had been waiting for him to find that symbol, waiting for him to touch it, to call it. A twisted feeling of realization settled over him. He had been chosen, and now he was theirs. He felt the first tendrils of cold seep into his body, moving through his veins like ice. The mark, whatever it was already sinking deeper into him, its power spreading like an infection, corrupting everything it touched. The figure rose, and as it did, the others around it began to move, circling him, stepping closer. He couldn't run. He couldn't escape. "You're ours now." The figure's voice echoed, and the shadows closed in, their dark forms melting into one another, until all he could see was darkness. The darkness was suffocating. Ethan's eyes snapped open, but everything was pitch black. He couldn't see his hands in front of his face. He couldn't hear anything except his own breathing, shallow and desperate, as if every inhale was being stolen from him. His chest tightened with each panicked breath, his heart thudding erratically in his chest. Where was he? What had happened? How had he gotten here? His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the last few moments, but all he could remember was the crushing, suffocating sensation of being surrounded by shadows. Then that voice, that cold, malevolent voice. It felt as though his very soul had been pulled into this endless void, into this inescapable abyss where the air itself felt like it was trying to suffocate him. There was no ground beneath him, no walls to anchor him. It was as if he was floating in nothingness, his body suspended, weightless, but heavy all at once. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. His limbs refused to obey, as though they had been paralyzed by some unseen force. "What is happening?" Ethan thought desperately. His hands shook and his mind screamed for answers, but there was no response. He could feel his heart racing in his chest, the blood pounding in his ears, but everything else was still, too still. There was no sound, no wind, no rustling leaves. The world had fallen silent around him. And then, just when he thought he might lose his mind from the silence, a sound cut through the stillness. At first, it was so faint, he thought it was his imagination. A soft, almost inaudible footstep, followed by another, then another. It was slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking toward him with no rush, no hurry, as if it had all the time in the world. The rhythmic footsteps echoed in the darkness, growing louder with each passing second. Ethan's pulse quickened. The footsteps were getting closer. He tried to turn his head, but his neck was stiff, frozen in place. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to move, but his body refused to respond. All he could do was wait. Wait for whatever it was to come closer. And then the voice spoke. It wasn't the whisper he had heard before. This time it was clearer, closer, like it was coming from inside his head. The voice was deep, low, and full of a cold, mocking tone. You've made a terrible mistake, Ethan. His heart skipped a beat. That voice, it sounded like the same voice from the fog, the one that had whispered in his ear earlier. The one that had told him he was marked, that there was no escape. But this time the voice was louder, sharper. It wasn't just in his mind, it was here, in this darkness. The footsteps continued, growing nearer, and Ethan's chest tightened with every step. He could feel the presence of whatever was coming closer, closer until it seemed to press in on him from all sides. The air around him grew colder, heavier. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape them. Asterisk, do you understand now, Ethan? Do you understand what you've done? Asterisk, he tried to scream. He tried to shout for help, for anyone to hear him, but his voice caught in his throat. There was no sound, no air. The pressure around him, the cold grip of something unseen, stole his voice. He was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. And then, suddenly, the air around him shifted. The footsteps stopped. There was no sound, no movement. Just the heavy silence pressing down on him. Asterisk, you can feel it, can't you? The weight of what you've called upon. The burden of the mark you've claimed. Asterisk, Ethan's breath was coming in ragged gasps. He tried to look around, but the darkness was so absolute, so impenetrable, that he couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. There was nothing, nothing but the shadows that swirled around him, consuming everything in their path. Asterisk, you belong to it now, Ethan. You are part of it. Asterisk, the voice was right next to him now, its cold breath brushing against his ear. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the words sank in, like knives twisting in his chest. He had called this. He had opened the door, allowed the darkness to pour in. And now there was no turning back. Asterisk, you've crossed a line you cannot uncross. You've stepped into a world that has no mercy. Asterisk, panic surged through Ethan's veins. He tried to stand, to escape, but his legs were leaden, his body unresponsive. The more he tried to move, the heavier the darkness pressed in, wrapping itself around him like chains. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming faster and more erratic, but he couldn't escape. The air was so thick now that it felt like he was suffocating, each breath more difficult than the last. Asterisk, there is no escape from what you've become, Ethan. You will never leave. Asterisk, the voice laughed then, low, dark, and full of malice. It was the laugh of something ancient, something that had existed long before him, long before any of this. Something that had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him. And then the presence, asterisk at asterisk, was upon him. Something cold, something dark, something that felt like it was made of the very shadows themselves reached out and grabbed him. It wasn't physical. Not in the way that a person might reach out and touch you. No, this was far worse. It was like an invisible hand wrapped around his chest, squeezing, crushing. His body felt as though it was being torn apart from the inside. The pressure was unbearable. Asterisk, you will understand soon enough. Asterisk, the voice came again and Ethan could feel it, feel the presence surrounding him, closing in from all sides. It wasn't just the voice anymore. It was everything. The darkness, the shadows. They were alive. And they were feeding on his fear, on his confusion. They were growing stronger with every passing second. And then everything shifted again. A sensation unlike anything he had ever felt before. It was as if the ground beneath him, what little ground existed, was being ripped away, the fabric of reality itself unraveling. Ethan could feel himself being pulled, drawn into the void, into the darkness. No, he wanted to scream, but there were no words. There was only the cold, only the suffocating weight of the shadows as they pulled him deeper, dragging him into the abyss. His hands clawed at the air, desperate to find something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing. Nothing but the cold, the dark, and the feeling that he was losing himself. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, it stopped. Ethan collapsed, gasping for air, his body trembling uncontrollably. He wasn't sure if he was still in the same place, if the darkness had lifted or if it was still around him. But there was no time to focus on that now. The pain in his chest, the crushing pressure in his lungs, was enough to keep him rooted in the present. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't hold him. He was too weak, too exhausted from the overwhelming force that had just attacked him. His body felt broken, every movement a struggle. And then, just when he thought he might finally lose himself, he heard something. A voice, no, many voices, whispering from all around him. Oh, hushed, urgent. Asterisk, it's not over. Asterisk, Ethan froze. The voices were all around him, inside his head, in the air, in the very shadows that surrounded him. Asterisk, you can never escape now, Ethan. You've called us. You've become us. Asterisk, a figure emerged from the darkness, its silhouette barely visible against the void. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its features hidden in shadow. But Ethan could feel its presence. He could feel it watching him, waiting. And he knew in that moment that his fight had only just begun. Ethan's pulse hammered in his chest, each beat feeling louder than the last, as if the very blood in his veins was pounding in protest to the cold, lifeless air that surrounded him. He was still kneeling on the ground, his hands pressed flat against the cold, unfamiliar surface. The voices, those whispers, were still echoing in his mind, weaving through his thoughts like a web of sharp needles. He could hear them clearer now, each one distinct, yet they all spoke in unison, an unnerving harmony of whispers that filled the empty void. Asterisk, you cannot hide from us, Ethan. Not now. Not ever. Asterisk. Ethan's head snapped around, his eyes frantic, but the darkness offered no answer, no sign of movement. The figure that had approached him moments earlier was gone, but the feeling that it was still there, watching him, waiting, remained. It was as though he was no longer alone, as though the shadows themselves had become sentient, aware, and alive. The fear within him surged again, clawing at his insides, making it hard to breathe, to think. What was happening to him? Why was he trapped in this nightmare? Every step he took to make sense of it seemed to lead him further into confusion, deeper into madness. And then the whispers returned, this time louder. Asterisk, you opened the door. You called us. And now we will never leave you. Asterisk. A cold, unbearable chill settled over him as the words sank in. His mind was reeling, racing to understand. He had been reckless. He had been warned. But now those warnings had become reality, and there was no escaping them. The more he thought about it, the more the horror of it all sank into his bones. Had it really been him? Had he really opened the door? He remembered the old book, the one he had found hidden in the attic of his new home. The one with the strange symbols, the unsettling drawings, the cryptic phrases that made his skin crawl when he read them. He had thought it was nothing more than a relic from the past, a collection of forgotten history. But when he had opened it, when he had recited those words, he had awakened something. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for someone foolish enough to give it life again. Asterisk, you called us. Asterisk, the voice echoed again, this time inside his mind. Asterisk, you brought us back into the world. Now you will pay the price. Asterisk. The realization hit Ethan like a slap to the face. It wasn't just the darkness that was following him. It wasn't just some random force of nature that had found him. It was them, the shadows, the figures, the things from the book. They were real, and they had found him. He scrambled to his feet, the world spinning around him as his thoughts tangled together, trying to make sense of it all. He could still feel the weight of their presence, like an unseen hand pressing against his chest, suffocating him, pulling him further into the darkness. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't just sit there and wait for them to claim him. He had to do something, anything, to escape, to fight back. With shaking hands, Ethan reached out, his fingers trembling as they touched the cold stone beneath him. Was this the ground? The floor? Was this even real? It felt wrong, alien, as if the very nature of his surroundings had shifted, had twisted into something unrecognizable. He felt as if he were trapped in a place that wasn't bound by the laws of nature, a place where reality itself had been distorted. His breath came faster now, panic creeping into his chest as he stood up, swaying slightly. He had to find a way out. He had to find something to break this nightmare. But where? The darkness was everywhere, impossible to escape, impossible to understand. Suddenly, a loud, jarring sound broke through the silence. The sound of something scraping against the stone, as if claws were dragging across the surface. The noise sent a wave of nausea through Ethan's stomach, and his heart skipped a beat. He spun around, eyes wide, but again there was nothing. Nothing except the suffocating blackness that pressed in on him. And then he heard it. A voice, distinct and clear, calling his name. Asterisk, Ethan. Asterisk. It was so real, so human. He felt a jolt of recognition. Asterisk, someone was here. Someone was calling him, asterisk, but when he turned to look, there was no one in sight. There was only the void. Only the suffocating darkness that seemed to grow larger, more oppressive with every passing second. His heart raced faster now, fear gripping him in a way he had never experienced before. He could feel it, the thing that watched him, the presence in the shadows, and he could feel that it was drawing closer. There was no escaping it, no running from it. He was trapped, completely, utterly trapped. The voice called again, softer now, more insistent. Asterisk, Ethan, come here. We're waiting for you. Asterisk. His instincts screamed at him to run, to flee, but his legs refused to move. His body felt as though it were rooted to the spot, as though the very ground beneath him had turned to stone, holding him in place. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His mind was spinning, trapped in the dark labyrinth of his own terror. And then, just when he thought he might collapse, the ground beneath him shifted. The stone trembled and a strange, low hum filled the air. It was an unnatural sound, deep and resonating, as though the very earth were alive, breathing beneath him. Ethan's chest tightened, his heart pounding against his ribcage. The shadows moved again, swirling around him like a living, breathing thing. The hum grew louder, more insistent, until it became a deafening roar. The darkness seemed to pulse with life, a deep, rhythmic thumping that made Ethan's head spin. He looked around, his eyes frantically searching for any sign of escape, but there was nothing. No doors, no windows, no way out. The ground beneath him began to crack, the sound sharp and violent, like something was breaking, tearing apart. And then, the hands came. They were cold, so cold, and they appeared from the darkness, reaching out to him with long, skeletal fingers, their nails scraping against the stone as they pulled themselves closer. Ethan tried to pull away, but the shadows wrapped around him, their icy grip tightening around his body. His breath hitched as he struggled against them, but it was useless. They were everywhere, crawling over him, pulling him down, dragging him into the abyss. And then a figure appeared from the darkness. Tall. Unnaturally tall. Its face was obscured by a hood, its form bathed in shadows. But Ethan could feel its eyes on him, cold, calculating, and full of something dark. Something ancient. You should not have called us, Ethan. The voice echoed through the darkness, clear and cold, like a whisper carried on the wind. But you did. And now you belong to us. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, his body trembling as the figure's hand reached out toward him, its long fingers brushing against his face. The touch was icy, burning through his skin like frostbite. Welcome to your new reality. And with that, the shadows tightened their grip, pulling him into the dark embrace of the void. His scream echoed through the emptiness. Chapter 6. The Abyss Calls. Ethan's body jerked awake, his breath ragged, his heart pounding as if it had just come back to life after being suffocated. His mind felt foggy, disconnected, as though reality itself was just an illusion slipping through his fingers. He had to force himself to focus. But the sensations, the fear, the cold, the suffocating weight of the darkness, were so overwhelming that they felt like they had never left him. The shadows were still there, lurking just out of his sight, always just beyond the reach of his understanding. His body trembled uncontrollably, his hands slick with sweat as he pushed himself into a sitting position, trying to find his bearings. The room around him was still completely dark, no light to guide him, no sound except for the rush of his panicked breath. You're not alone, Ethan. The voice. It came again, a sharp whisper that echoed in his mind, curling its way around his thoughts like a snake. It was the same voice, the same cold presence he had heard before. He could feel it pressing against his skull, pushing into his consciousness, filling him with dread. His heart skipped a beat. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't escape it. The voice wasn't just in his head, it was everywhere. It was in the walls, the very air around him, closing in, seeping into his soul. The darkness felt heavier now. The air was thick, so thick it was almost suffocating. Ethan tried to rise to his feet, but his legs felt weak, like they had been drained of strength. He stumbled, his knees buckling beneath him as the darkness pressed down, suffocating him, pulling him further into its depths. His body ached, his chest tight, but no matter how much he fought against the paralysis, it was as if the very air itself was pressing against him, holding him in place. A cold shiver crawled down his spine as the voice spoke again. You belong to us now. The words wrapped themselves around his mind like chains, tightening with every syllable, until Ethan's chest felt like it was being crushed. His hands shook as he pressed them against his ears, trying to block out the sound, to block out the reality that was closing in on him. But it was useless. The words were already inside him, lodged deep in his thoughts. There was no escape. A low, rumbling sound filled the space, like the distant growl of something ancient and monstrous, something that had been waiting for centuries. Ethan's pulse quickened, his mind spinning as the sound grew louder. He didn't need to see it to know it was there. He could feel it. The very ground beneath him seemed to shake, like it was trembling in response to the darkness that was surrounding him. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing, but his chest felt too tight. The air was thin, suffocating. He could hardly think straight, his thoughts racing in every direction, desperately searching for a way out. But there was nothing. No way out. No escape. Just the deep, oppressive silence and the darkness closing in. The growl became louder, more distinct, and Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his ears as the world around him shifted. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness thickening, growing, twisting into something more solid. He tried to stand again, but his legs betrayed him, collapsing beneath him as the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. Asterisk, you cannot hide, Ethan. Not from us. Asterisk. The voice was closer now, so close that it felt like it was coming from within his very body. His hands trembled uncontrollably as they reached out, clawing at the ground beneath him, desperate for some form of reality, some form of escape. But the ground was cold, unnaturally cold, as if the earth itself had been turned to ice. His breath caught in his throat as the cold seeped into his bones, making him feel as though he were being frozen from the inside out. Then there was a shift in the air. A sudden, sharp crack, like a tree branch snapping under the weight of something heavy. Ethan's eyes snapped open, but he couldn't see anything. The darkness around him was absolute. It was as though he had been pulled into a void where nothing existed but the heavy weight of fear pressing down on him, suffocating him. And then from the blackness came the sound. A voice, but not just any voice. It was familiar. It was the voice he had heard before, but this time it was different. There was an urgency, a malevolence, a hunger in its tone. Asterisk, Ethan, you've crossed the line. Asterisk. The words felt like ice being poured into his veins. He gasped, his chest tightening as the shadows seemed to close in tighter. The very air felt thick with malevolence, like it was pressing against him from all sides. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. Every muscle in his body screamed for release, but his body refused to respond. He was trapped. There was no escape. The darkness seemed to grow, swelling and pulsing like a living entity, breathing, waiting. Ethan's mind raced. He had read the warnings. He had heard the stories. But he never thought it would be like this. He never thought that he, of all people, would be the one to suffer the consequences. The door he had opened, the words he had spoken, they had unleashed something. And now there was no stopping it. The rumbling, the growling, the sound of something far too large, too monstrous, grew louder, until it seemed to reverberate in the very core of his being. Ethan pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound wouldn't go away. It was inside him, consuming him, twisting his thoughts, his emotions, until all that was left was fear. And then, in the suffocating silence that followed, he heard it. A whisper. A soft, almost intimate whisper that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Asterisk, you're ours now, Ethan. There's no turning back. Asterisk. His breath caught in his throat, his heart hammering as the shadows seemed to move around him, closing in, forming something dark and twisted. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came. His throat had closed up, his lungs unable to pull in air. He was drowning in the darkness. The shadows were everywhere now, around him, inside him, suffocating him. He was losing himself, losing his grip on reality, as the whispers continued to echo in his mind. Asterisk, you've awakened us. Now you will never be free. Asterisk. The pressure in his chest grew unbearable, and he collapsed onto the cold ground, gasping for air, but none came. The shadows pressed in around him, engulfing him, pulling him deeper into the abyss. His body trembled uncontrollably as the voice, asterisk, the presence asterisk, grew louder, more powerful. Asterisk, we are the darkness that lives inside you. We are your nightmare, and you will never escape us. Asterisk. The last thing Ethan heard was the sound of his own breath, ragged, shallow, desperate, as the world around him dissolved into nothingness, swallowed whole by the suffocating darkness. How was Chapter 6 now? Ready for Chapter 7? Let me know if you'd like any more adjustments. Ethan's consciousness flickered back to him, but there was no clarity, no return to reality. His mind was hazy, clouded by confusion and dread, like a fog that wouldn't lift. The sensation of floating lingered, as if his very body was no longer bound to the laws of gravity, no longer tethered to the world he had known. It was as though he was suspended in a space outside time, trapped between existence and oblivion. He opened his eyes, but there was nothing, only darkness. Thick, suffocating darkness that pressed in on him from all sides, making his breath quicken with anxiety. His hands grasped at the emptiness, fingers brushing against what felt like cold air, Yet nothing about the space around him seemed natural. The absence of any form, any shape, felt like an unnatural void. There was no floor beneath him, no sky above him. It was as though the very concept of space had been torn apart, leaving only an infinite blackness. A cold dread seeped into his bones as he realized there was no escape. He couldn't move. He couldn't think straight. His chest tightened, his lungs refusing to fill with air, and for a moment he wondered if he was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare that had no end. Then, a whisper slithered through the air, a whisper that he could feel more than hear, a voice that clawed at his consciousness like a claw dragging across glass. Asterisk, you're still here, Ethan? Asterisk. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. It echoed in the depths of his mind, reverberating with an unnatural calm. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, a force. Something ancient, something malevolent that had always been there, even before he realized it. Something that had been waiting for him to slip up, to call it into being. And now that it had been awakened, it would never leave him. Asterisk, you belong to us now. Asterisk. The words washed over him like a cold wave, sending a shiver down his spine. His heart skipped a beat and his stomach twisted with fear. His mind screamed for him to fight, to escape, but his body refused to respond. He was paralyzed, suspended in the dark void, at the mercy of whatever this entity was. The darkness around him seemed to press in even closer, its weight growing heavier with each passing second. He could feel it crawling under his skin, seeping into his very soul, as though the shadows were claiming him, marking him as their own. It was as if the void itself had become a part of him, connecting with his very essence. Asterisk, you can't escape, Ethan. You never could. Asterisk. The voice wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a command, a statement of fact. The truth was undeniable. Ethan had made a mistake that would cost him everything. He had opened the door, invited the darkness in, and now it was too late to undo the damage. Panic surged through him as he struggled to move, to do anything. His body remained still, frozen in the void. His muscles screamed, his veins pulsed with adrenaline, but it was like trying to move through concrete. The sensation of paralysis was overwhelming. He was trapped. And no matter how much he fought against it, there was no escaping it. The voice continued, its tone growing darker, more menacing. Asterisk, you've called us forth, Ethan. You've awakened us from our slumber, and now, you will pay the price. Asterisk. The words dripped with malice, each one feeling like a dagger stabbing into his heart. His body felt like it was being crushed under the weight of it, like the very air around him was growing heavier, tighter, suffocating him. His chest burned, his lungs struggling for air that didn't exist in this place. He could feel the darkness creeping through his thoughts, pushing into his mind, filling him with terror and dread that he couldn't shake. And then something shifted. The emptiness around him seemed to stir, as if the void was alive. It wasn't just stillness anymore, it was an active force, a presence that surrounded him, pressing in, pushing him further into the abyss. Ethan's heart pounded as a low rumble filled the space. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere, vibrating through the void like a tremor. It wasn't a sound that was external, though. It was internal, resonating deep within his chest, beneath his skin. It was the sound of something ancient, something monstrous, stirring from its slumber, hungry and waiting. Asterisk, you've become one of us, Ethan. You've always been one of us. You just didn't know it yet. Asterisk. The voice wasn't coming from any single direction. It was everywhere, inside his mind, around him. It seemed to penetrate his thoughts, weaving through his consciousness, erasing any sense of self. The darkness had become a part of him, had merged with his very being, until there was no distinction between where he ended and the void began. He thought he heard footsteps, but there was nothing to see. The void remained impenetrable, a blackness so complete that his eyes couldn't even register the movement. The sensation of something moving around him, circling him, was all too real. It was like being stalked by a predator that was both everywhere and nowhere, its presence felt but never seen. His mind was slipping, the terror rising as his thoughts became more and more disjointed. Every moment felt like an eternity. He couldn't tell how long he had been trapped in the void, but the sensation of time, of existence itself, had begun to lose meaning. He was no longer sure if he was still alive. There was no proof of his reality, no proof of anything. Suddenly, a sharp, searing pain sliced through his chest, as though something had reached inside him and torn his heart apart. He gasped for air, but none came. His throat constricted, his vision blurred as the pressure built, rising, tightening, until it felt like his very body was being crushed under the weight of the darkness. Asterisk, this is your punishment, Ethan. You will never be free. You will never see the light again. Asterisk. The words echoed in his mind, growing louder, more insistent. The pain intensified, spreading through his entire body, as though his very cells were being pulled apart. Every nerve felt like it was on fire, every inch of his skin crawling with the sensation of being torn asunder. But it wasn't just physical pain. It was emotional, psychological. It was a complete, total devastation of his mind and soul. The darkness had consumed him, and now it was tearing him apart from the inside out. Asterisk, you are ours. Forever. Asterisk. The presence surged forward, flooding his mind with images, flashes of grotesque shapes, nightmarish figures, visions of twisted, broken things that shouldn't exist. They weren't real, he knew that. But the fear they instilled in him was all too real. It was as though the very fabric of reality was being warped, twisted by something far beyond human understanding. And through it all, the voice was there, like an insistent, unyielding presence that filled every corner of his mind. Asterisk, you've crossed the line, Ethan. And now you will never escape the consequences. Asterisk. His chest tightened once more, the pressure unbearable, as if something invisible was holding him in place. He tried to scream, to fight, but it was useless. The darkness had him, and there was no way out. In that moment, Ethan understood the truth. He had been warned countless times. He had ignored the signs, dismissed the fear, thinking he could control what he had unleashed. But the darkness was not something to be controlled. It was not something to be understood. It was something ancient, something primal, and it had claimed him. The void around him was no longer a place. It was him. He was the darkness now, consumed by it, swallowed whole. The entity that had once haunted his nightmares, the presence that had whispered in his ear, was no longer external. It was inside him, part of him, and there was no way to separate the two. And as the final grip of the abyss closed in around him, Ethan felt a cold, terrifying certainty. There was no escape from this. He would never wake up. He would never see the light again. He had crossed into the darkness, and now he was one with it. Asterisk, you are ours, Ethan. You always were. Asterisk. And then silence.